I think people suffer needlessly because they confuse the distorted narrative running inside of their minds with actual reality. But if I'm right, and we don't have access to the quote unquote real world, and instead we're just a brain in a vat running a simulation, what do we need to understand about the nature of this self-generated simulation in order to live our lives well?
When we talk about the brain and the vat, of course, the vat here is, as far as you know, our physical body that is marching through a physical universe and contains a skull full of cells that have to get along and generate a model of reality and of the individual itself and its relationship to reality. And the purpose of that whole thing is to feed all these cells and to keep them in play. And not just for this generation, but over many, many generations, because we evolved not for this particular moment in time, but for a longer course. And in this long multi-generational course, we adapted to certain circumstances, basically conditions under which our ancestors live. And in many ways, our world has changed in the last few generations rapidly, away from the ways in which our grandparents lived their lives. And these discontinuities are, on one hand, extremely exciting, and they force us to adapt to new circumstances. But they also are very unusual from an evolutionary perspective for the things that we're confronted with. So a lot of the experience that we have are alienating. And it's also very difficult to see in the future and to see how long we'll be around as a species, whether our children or grandchildren will still use any of the thoughts that we have today and any of the things that we built today for them. And this creates justifiably anxiety, right? If we live in a world that possibly has no future for us, or if there's no future extension of us present in the world, it's unsettling. And I think it's a justified experience to have that. When we start creating the mental model, we are not even born yet. And I think that in utero already we are starting to prepare a map of our body and how it relates to our needs. We experience our first pleasure and pain probably to some degree. And after we are born, we are focused on a world that has an up and down direction, and which light is playing out. And we see patterns in the light and in directions. And we are able to discern sounds. And at some point, a few months in, we are able to correlate the sound and the directions. And we also notice that the space that you're observing is all the same space. It's the space in which that we can touch. And so at every moment, we find ourselves in a scene. And this word model, the scene, is something that our ancestors discovered early on, that we generate this, that our own consciousness creates this. But when we start our own memories as a human being, we're typically beyond the stage where we create the world. We are personal selves at this point. And when we try to remember how our life started, I think what we remember are those moments where this personal self is already online, because that's right now the vantage point from which I assemble reality, right? It's me remembering being a person in this world that is being generated in my mind. So I'm no longer the consciousness that creates the world around me in my own mind, that runs a simulation engine in my brain that tracks visual data and perceptual data, but I am a being that cares about what it sees in this world, and you can no longer directly change my perception. I also can no longer directly change my emotion. I'm basically exposed to my perception and to my emotion and have to deal with them. And as I grow up, I can build models of the purposes that emerge over my feelings and emotions and needs and desires and fears. And in this way, I create a model of the world that I'm in. And I discover I'm not alone in this world, but there are purposes that I share with others. And in this sense, I experience myself as a social being, as a state-building creature that together with others is not only making plans and is trying to change the world in a particular way and specialized in the hive, but we're also creating reality together. We have shared models of reality that we exchange.
How close are the models of reality that we have to actual base reality?
Well, they are coarse-grained models of base reality, which means that they are generalizations over the perceptual data at the resolution in time and space that our percepts have. Which means, for instance, if our neurons take 20 milliseconds to pass on a signal from one neuron to the next, this determines the temporal resolution in which they can be excited and track phenomena. And when we are trying to integrate a scene, and it's the question, how many neural junctures does the signal need to pass until it computes the necessary functions. And so I observe that my sense of now that I'm in can be a fraction of a second, and it can be something like up to 3 seconds that I perceive as one cohesive moment of now. And the physical now, of course, is different from this. It's spread out much further. So there are things in my perceptual now that are predictive, that are basically playing out in the future. And there are things in my perceptual now that had played out in the past, signals that I just experienced now and need to integrate into my model, despite a signal from my feet needing hundreds of milliseconds until it arrives in my neocortex, and then a few more 100 milliseconds until it's processed, and when it's surprising to be integrated in my world model, right? So this subjective now is a fiction, and the subjective now is constructed. And in the physical world, there are no colors and no sounds. There are also no waves in the ocean, right? There are molecules that exist in the ocean that pull and push at each other, producing something that looks like waves when you zoom very far out. And there is no sound in the air. There is just air molecules pushing at each other in regular patterns. And we pick out energy spectra from these regular patterns and translate them into mathematical models that we experience as sound. And there are no colors in the world. Instead, we have receptors for photons at different energy levels. And we sample in certain ranges. And from these samples, we try to integrate a model of what the photons have been doing and the direction that they possibly came from. And this is the type of model that we are building, right? This is the distance that it has from the underlying reality. Of course, there is the question, what is the substrates in which the photons emerge? And according to our current understanding, we can propose that there is some basic underlying field that is being excited to produce waves and particles that we perceive as photons, and that there are, in the same way, there is air that can be excited to produce the elements of sound, the phonons that travel through the air and can be perceived in our mind as the outcome of these waves and these energy patterns. The underlying quantum mechanics is also an observer-dependent perspective. It's something what the universe perceives us to from the perspective of the measurement of the experimenter and the most elegant mathematical model that I can fit to those measurements to make sense of them. Right? This is how far we can go. And then there's the question, what is base reality below that? So what are the conditions of a universe that can exist by itself without an additional cause, without an additional underlying substrate? And how far are we from this level? And there are relatively few people which make theories in this regard. One of them who is bold enough is, for instance, Stephen Wolfram, who believes that we can describe the world as basically a superposition of all automata, of all base operations that can be performed, and they happen. And I'm not sure if he would say this, but I think they mostly happen because nothing prevents them from happening. So if the universe has nothing that stops it from existing, the default is not that nothing exists, but there is a possibility of existence. And we might be existing in one of those possibilities. Right? There's a stream of possibilities that where we apply all the possible operators on top of each other. And within that stream of possibilities, there are sometimes statistical regularities, parts of the universe that are so regular that other parts of the universe can predict them. So control structure is possible. And sometimes the control structure becomes stable enough to form molecules and then cells and then organisms. And we can only emerge as observers if we have such structure, if we can form organisms that can reflect a regular environment around them. So the only parts of the universe that we can perceive are those that contribute to the structure that we are. And of those, we can only perceive those where we have instruments for perceiving them at the level and resolution where we exist. Right? So I would not say in the same way as Donald Hoffman that reality looks nothing like what we perceive. There is something about reality that we perceive correct, but it's coarse-grained, which means you see high-level patterns in a similar way as you coarse-grain the ocean when you look at it and you cannot see the molecules, and instead you try to perceive it as waves.
Okay, so out of curiosity, if the simulation is a pure representation of what's going on underneath, it's at a very coarse level, what makes you think that it is directly correlated? So when you think about a computer, and this is definitely Donald Hoffman's take, So a computer is turning electrical circuits on and off. That's all you have. So that creates a perception if you're playing a video game of like, oh, I'm, running around. The example he always uses is Grand Theft Auto, running around. I jump in a car, I turn the wheel. It gives me the perception that I'm moving this car inside this world. But in reality, all I'm doing is, in base reality, all I'm doing is toggling electrical voltages on and off. And so the level of abstraction is complete. What about that is wrong? Why do you have confidence that there is a map to direct reality and it just isn't very granular?
So when we think about what neurons are doing, they also basically turn currents on and off. And these currents are implemented in part as chemical signals. Some of them are probably mechanical signals, electromagnetic signals, and so on. And what neurons are mostly exchanging are these neurotransmitters at the gap junctures. And in between the neurons, there are currents that flow and trigger these excitations that then lead to the release of chemicals that the next neuron can perceive. Right? It's quite similar to what the transistors are doing. There is a slight difference in terms of the way in which this comes about, because our brain is a self-organizing system. All the organization happens inside out, and our computers are constructed systems where an engineer goes and forces patterns on the functioning of the system. So we force the transistor to work in a particular way. We force transistors in a particular pattern that can represent a logical function. And then we can write logical functions that are imposed on these transistors, whether they like it or not, and then compute a program that is making sense or not of the data that come into a camera, for instance. Whereas in our own brain, every individual cell needs to have its own control. There is nothing that is able to control the cell from the outside. The cell is trainable from the outside. It can be fed and it can be killed and can probably be rewarded and punished beyond this. But all the control is in the individual cell. This is the machinery that works in our organism. And the individual cells are exchanging patterns of information. And some of these patterns of information are constrained by perception. They're constrained by our sensory cells that put certain patterns into the system, and the system learns that it makes sense to pay attention to those patterns and to predict them, because this allows the organism to navigate the world around it and find food. Right? So it's something that just emerges over the need of the individual cells to feed themselves. And they can only feed themselves if they cooperate in our body. If they don't figure this out, they're going to starve and die. And of course, we are evolved into particular functional differentiation. So having a bunch of cells that are tasked with functioning as an eye and a bunch of cells that tasked with functioning as a brain or as a liver or as a heart is something that the organism is not going to learn in one generation, but it does require many generations of successive specialization in which we acquire more and more function. But the universe that we are in does not look very different from what I would expect if the universe is one that is just emerging over mathematical necessities. In some sense, I think the question is not so much physicalism or panpsychism or something else, but it's physicalism or a simulation theory. Physicalism is the idea that the universe has a mechanical, causally closed layer. And the alternative to mechanical here is symbolic. Symbolic means magic. It means meaning that exists because of the force of will of something, not because of the necessarily an underlying structure independently of that will, right? So when you think of a simulation like Minecraft, that's something that exists due to the will of the programmer turned into a program. And if you find the same interface that the programmer did, or if the programmer leaves an interface for you, like the shell in Minecraft that you can call up to let the sun rise or go down, or create objects in your environment or teleport, right? All these are tricks that are only possible because Minecraft is a magical universe. It's one where a mind has right access on the rules in which reality works. And all these alternatives to physicalism are in some sense simulation theories that require that there is a mind that is realized in some kind of mechanical parent universe. And of course, you could stack these simulation universes. So you can have in Minecraft, create a computer from rocks that you mine in Minecraft from redstone. And then you can create logical gates from these redstone circuits and then build a computer that is even able to run Minecraft, although very, very, very slowly. But some people have done it. They have implemented a version of Minecraft that runs extremely slowly on a computer in Minecraft. It's beautiful art. Basically, there is no limit to the number of stacks that you can build, except at some point it's going to be so slow that before you go to the next state, the sun and the parent universe is going to burn out, and you can no longer run your computer to process the simulation.
I've heard you talk about this before. It's running at something like 2 million times slower than the normal Minecraft. So if you want to see it at the normal speed, you have to speed it up. It's really fascinating. So that's a really important distinction. And you're getting to what I have a gut instinct is the nature of things, which is that you have a universe. It is real, it is physical, but the brain is running a true simulation. So in terms of our experience, this is why you can take psychedelics, completely break the simulation. I don't think you're breaking the machinery itself, which is why you return to normal, but you can break the simulation such that you are basically astral projected if you're doing DMT or something, which I have not done. But the way that people describe it, it sounds like you really sort of leave this planet, if you will. And that's just manipulating the simulation. It's not manipulating the underlying reality. And this is where I've always been a little bit dubious. I love Donald Hoffman. I've had him on the show multiple times, but I've always been a little dubious about whether this is a pure simulation that we exist in or not. And I think because eventually you would have to bump up against, there is something physical somewhere that is running this. I don't see any reason to keep pushing that farther and farther out. I think that the important thing for the human experience is you have to understand your brain is running a simulation. To your point, there's no such thing as color. There's no such thing as quote unquote sound. Those are our interpretations of it. I've never heard anybody use the ocean waves, but that's another great example. The waves aren't real. That's you coming way back out. And you're seeing something that then looks like a wave, but the reality is there's something going on underneath that. So my thing is when I look at the world from that perspective, okay, there is a physical thing here that I have evolved to do well. My simulation has evolved. So my inner world, what we perceive as quote unquote reality, that has evolved to give me predictive ability through simplification, if I had to guess, to be able to navigate the real world well. So I am in a physical universe. The way that I perceive it is a complete abstraction. And so then for me, it becomes a question of, you had said earlier that we don't have control of our emotions. That doesn't ring true to me. I think we have a pretty limited window, but when you think about like a Buddhist monk that can light himself on fire and not seem to outwardly express the kind of suffering that I would think I would be going through. So there is some level of control that we can exert once we understand how our cognition works, how our mental models work, how that layer of abstraction works.
Yes, I agree. You can get to the level where you have control over the construction of your own self. I once tried to express this as a ladder of stages that you could think of as. I don't think that people move through these stages in succession, and I don't think it's a game where you have a score if you get to a higher stage. But at the lowest level, so to speak, we exist just in the here and now when we are babies. We cannot perceive past and future yet or anticipate them. And at some point, we are able to extend ourselves over time and separate between self and world. And at a later stage, we are able to identify our own goals and then learn how to control our own goals and derive them from our needs and establish purposes. And then when we form our models of reality, we usually form them together with others. And most people get to a stage where they're able to perceive a social self. Basically, they read the room and they become part of that room. And in becoming part of this room in the widest possible sense, they have a shared morality with people around them and a shared construction of reality. And the next stage is that you discover rationality and you discover things are true and false independently of what others believe. When you can get to this stage, your ideas mean something independently of what others think, because you're now able to take responsibility for your beliefs. You're able to make derivations and disprove things that you believe. You have a choice over your beliefs. And in the next stage, you would discover how your own identity is constructed. And then when you construct your own identity, you realize that people are different because they're born in different places, and then different things happen to them, and they started out with different traits. But we get more and more agency as we get older over this identity. And we realize that our values are not something that is axiomatically given, but that we can choose. And we can choose it according to the worlds that we want and that are achievable for us. right? So what is the harmonic world that I want to contribute to? And from this perspective, I can start to evaluate values and choose values and construct who I am as a being. And on the next stage, I can transcend what I am as a human being. So I go back to the beyond this personal self that I constructed as a child and see myself from the outside. I see how I construct this personal self. And I'm no longer Joscha Bach, but Joscha Bach is a representation inside of me that I can influence and shift around. And Joscha Bach cares about stuff, and I can decide what he should care about, but I'm not him. Instead, I'm not an I. There's just a set of generation functions, and I can observe what these generation functions are trying to optimize for, and maybe influence them and observe the outcomes of this.
I really want to understand that. So I'm not him, these generation functions. So if you're not him, you're not your identity, what is that relationship? What is the sense of I'm not him in that scenario? Him is obviously the identity. What's the I'm?
When we start out as infants, I think that we are just the dreamer. There's basically something that dreams. It's an attention that is reflexive and that notices itself attending. I suspect that this is necessary to make us coherent. So basically, we have this spark that tries to observe itself observing. It doesn't know how to talk about this. It doesn't know how to reflect this very much. But what makes consciousness is awareness of awareness. There's a reflexive element in it. And I suspect that we need to become conscious to train our own brain to perceive reality and to make sense of it. And so we built a toolbox to make sense of reality. Right? When we are conscious and awake, we can construct our mental representations and change them. We can construct things in our inner stage. We can look into the world of perception and decide how we parse the perception, what we attend to, what's background, what's foreground, what things are meaningful to us, how our reality is being constructed from the percepts. And these are all skills that we get. And when we are inebriated or tired or asleep and dream, then parts of this functionality can be missing and can dissociate. Or when we become demented or have a developmental problem in our brain, we might not be able to get agency over the way in which we construct reality and remain at the stage of where something is being dreamt. And when this active dreamer is gone, this thing that perceives and constructs reality, then we fall asleep. We might be a sleepwalker, we might even be moving, but there will be no coherence in our actions. And so we will not be able to learn in this state, and we will not be able to perform goal-directed actions that make sense in terms of our purposes. And so consciousness is at the core, I think, the ability to become coherent. And then it's something that is gathering more and more skills as we grow up. And as we get more skills, we understand, we reflect more what we are. And consciousness begins to understand itself. It begins to understand at first that it's not actually the personal self, but it's attention on that personal self and identification with the personal self. And when we transcend this identification with the personal self, we perceive it from the outside.
You can reboot your life, your health, even your career, anything you want. All you need is discipline. I can teach you the tactics that I learned while growing a billion-dollar business that will allow you to see your goals through. Whether you want better health, stronger relationships, a more successful career, any of that is possible with the mindset and business programs in Impact Theory University. Join the thousands of students who have already accomplished amazing things. Tap now for a free trial and get started today.
I didn't start drinking until very late in my life. So when I had my first drinking experience, I became very aware of what I called the overwatch mechanism. And I think that's what you're describing here. And so you'll hear a lot about the hard problem of consciousness. Look, out of ignorance, like if you've seen those memes where it's like the small brain guy is, says one thing, and then the midbrain guy says something else, and then the big brain guy says the same thing as the small brain guy. So for me, it was like, there's no hard problem of consciousness. I'm the small brain. Normal people are like, oh my God, like hard problem of consciousness. And then the smartest people, I have a feeling, come back around to it's not a hard problem. So I'd love to get your take. So I have this drink. I'm intoxicated, but I have a sense of I am standing outside the intoxication and still watching my body be intoxicated. So I was aware of the ways in which I was acting differently. And so I found it very interesting that I still did not find myself with an impulse to do things I wouldn't do when I was sober. And so I have no embarrassing stories from drinking because that overwatch mechanism is always there. That overwatch mechanism is present in my dreams. So even though I can't track the logic of the dream, I will occasionally be like, wait, I'm almost certain I'm dreaming right now. So that same sense of like, there's some part of me that's watching this. So it seems to me that evolution would build that mechanism in necessarily as a way to be able to formulate a simulation so that I can make sense of the simplification. That like, if you are not going to take in all of the data present in reality, you would need consciousness to navigate that well. If you're going to use adaptation as a strategy. I can feel that falling apart as I think about like tardigrades and things, which I very much doubt have a sense of self. So I'm really curious, what do you think about that? Where is my logic breakdown?
I don't think that there is a breakdown of your logic. I guess that when we are looking naively at the world, we do not notice the fact very much that consciousness could be in any way mysterious. It's only when we think of the world in terms of function and we observe that in the world around us, functions are created by objects pushing and pulling at each other. It becomes difficult to understand how something that like the mind could exist, because it's clearly not made of things pushing and pulling at each other, yet the entire physical universe seems to be stuff pushing and pulling at each other, right? So at this point, you wonder, how does this come about? How can be something purely causal structure, and how is it possible that something that is purely causal structure can perceive? And I think that we learn to understand this with the notion of software, because software is purely causal structure that is in the sense disembodied. And the computer is a causal insulator. It's something that works the same way regardless of what the universe around it is doing within a certain range. So you can take my laptop or my phone and can take it to a different place, say to a mountaintop or to Europe, or to a place that is 5 degrees centigrade hotter than here, and it's still going to work. And it's still going to perform the same function despite the physical environment around it changing and working a different way. And once you have such a universal causal substrate that is able to harbor causal state changes based on some kind of recipe that I put into it, then this thing can be used to make arbitrary models of the future and in the past. Because such models need to be different from what's happening right now. They need to be decoupled from what's happening right now. And when you take such a system and couple it with the outside world, so you, in a very controlled way, allow the environment to influence states of that system, then it's able to explain the patterns that it's being entangled with. And these patterns that it's entangled with could be, for instance, the camera image or the patterns on your retina. And you explain them by using the information that you gathered in the past, that you turned into models in your brain to predict what's going to happen next. And the elements of these models are, for instance, the scene. And in a scene, like a scene in a computer game, you have a scene controller that contains object controllers, that have feature controllers that interact with each other, and that are being projected with a particular kind of perspective onto an agent that is also simulated in this world. And the agent also cares about things. So the agent is being told what it cares about via emotions and motivation. And the agent is a system that is looking into the world from its own perspective, and it's a simulation. That means it's as if. It's behaving as if there was something that is looking and cares, and that it solves these problems as if it would be solving them, which in this case is the same thing, because if you do as if in a causal structure, it's the same thing as if you do it in another causal structure, right? So software can be emulated using other software. And when you, for instance, follow a planning procedure, then a simulation of this planning procedure is the same thing as following the planning procedure. In this level, there is no more difference between a simulation and a simulation of that simulation, right? And so mental processes of this nature, they are representational. They are not physical processes, even though they're implemented by physics. They're realized through physical processes as far as we know. But they are processes that in their purpose create representations, and these representations have set up in such a way that they causally influence the further generation of representations. And so we create our own thoughts, which are representations, and these thoughts are being interpreted by the system that generates them, and they cause the next thought, and the next thought, and the next, and these thoughts cause our behavior. and they cause structuring of our mind and so on. So there's causal structures that are implemented on the physical level, but by their nature, they are built in such a way that they are invariant to the small, tiny changes that the physical universe is producing by itself without us controlling it. And it's true both in the computers that we are building that run software in a deterministic way, and it's also true for our brains that run software by producing patterns in self-organizing cells.
So is free will an illusion?
It depends on how we define free will. Most people, when they want to talk about free will and explain it, they point at something that they perceive. And what they perceive is a sense of agency. They notice that they make decisions for the first time, and they cannot predict these decisions before they make them. If you could predict your decisions before you make them, or if they're not decisions, but just apparent glitches in your the behavior of a nervous system, you do not perceive them as free will, right? When you slide on a banana, that's not free will. But when you make a deliberation over the outcomes of your actions, and then after considering the best possible outcomes based on what you know, and you enact this, then you perceive it as free will. And I think that free will is the perception of this process. So in this sense, I believe that the Calvinists, for instance, had the wrong interpretation of free will. Calvinism is the stream within Christianity that reformed Catholicism, because they thought, if God knows everything, how can we have free will? But if we have free will, then our actions cannot, if we don't have free will, how can our actions influence whether we go to heaven or not? So in Calvinism, it's preordained whether you go to heaven or not, regardless of what you do, because what you do has been preordained by God at the before time, right? So I think this is a misunderstanding, because if your prospects of going to hell influence your behavior or going to heaven, then they have causal relevance, right? So just by telling people the fact that if you do X, then you're likely going to end up in this place, and people believe that or take this into consideration, then it's going to have a causal influence on their actions. And of course, you can follow the reason why is somebody telling me this. Do they have free will, right? And so they might also think that there is a better possible outcome if they influence me and you go forth and forth. And you have to understand the reason why they do is because nature has set them up as a system that controls the future. Agents are systems that are meant to control the future. And they do this by modeling them and then making decisions based on those models.
Can you define an agent really fast?
Okay, the simplest explanation for what an agent is, and it's a notion that is very popular in computer science, so I try to get the simplest one, is a controller for future states. A controller is a system like a thermostat, right? You all know this example of the thermostat. It has, for instance, a metal piece that is reacting to temperature. And when the temperature is at a particular range, it's going to close an electrical contact, and that contact is turning on the heating. And when the temperature goes above a certain level, then this metal contact bends due to the heat, and it disengages, and the heating gets turned off. And in this way, you can have an adjustable heating just by adjusting the position of this strip of metal. You can get it sensitive to its particular target temperature, and then it's going to achieve this target temperature. It's an extremely simple circuit that is not an agent. It's only regulating the present. It's only using the present state of this measurement instrument, of this bimetal strip, and that corresponds to the temperature in the room, and then performs an action. And this action in the here and now is going to influence the outcome. But now imagine you want to build a more efficient heating, one that is taking into account how long it takes for the temperature in the room to change. So for instance, you could turn off the heating a little bit for the peak, because you know the heating is going to continue for a while before it cools down again. And you might also even model that certain times of day, somebody is going to open the window, and that's going to influence it. And maybe there's weather outside, and you can access the weather report and can take this into consideration. And so the more you can model about reality, the more efficient you can heat. And you do this by basically trying to model the deviation between the target temperature and the current temperature in the future for a branching path of possible futures. And some of these branches in the future are being controlled by your own actions, by whether you will turn on the heating at that point or not, right? And so you can make a plan of when you want to turn on the heating, under which conditions. And as a result, when you learn, you get much, much better and more efficient at heating. And so in this sense, this is an agent, because it's one that has a model of reality, it has beliefs, and it has expectations over the future, over which some prefers and others not. So it has intentions. and it can commit to those intentions and turn them into goals. And in this way, you get all the properties of an agent just out of control in future states. So an agent is a controller for future states.
All right. So then I trust humans fall into that definition.
Yes, cells also do that. Right? Cells seem to be the simple system that we know in nature that are agents.
So you think cells are trying to predict the future?
Implicitly, evolution forces them to become aware of future trajectories by implementing a number of programs into their DNA and other mechanisms in the cell that make it ready to react to certain things. So for instance, when an amoeba that feeds gets a certain condition in its environment, it notices that there's prey nearby and it's going to get closer to this prey, right? And it might not have a concept of prey, or very likely doesn't have that, but it has reactivity to sensors that get it onto a trajectory in which it behaves in such a way that it changes its behavior according to what it can expect in the future to happen. That is, that it's going to find prey in a particular kind of direction. And a neuron in your brain also needs to be an agent, right?
Would it be fair to say that at the cell level, it's if this, then that?
So everything is if this, then that. But very often you don't know what's going to happen. And it's not only going to work based on the present. It's also going to work based on the state that the cell is in. So when the amoeba is in the hunting mode, it probably needs to turn a switch inside of itself. That is switch turned on when the amoeba is more hungry and when it sensed something that looks like food in its environment. And then it's going to have some kind of tendency to go into the environment where it's more likely to find food. So it's going to interpret some of the signals that it receives from its environment at its cellular boundary as rules or as incentives to go in a particular kind of direction because it's more likely to find food there. So in this sense, it's all if-then. But a lot of the if is the state of the system, and a lot of that state is representational, which means it does not really depend on the particular arrangement of the molecules in the cell, but it depends on a mechanism that is interpreting this particular arrangement of molecules and many other similar and sometimes dissimilar arrangements of molecules in a particular way as information of the state the cell has to be in and the behavior that it should pursue.
Okay, so this is asking me to differentiate between two things. So when I think about a single-celled organism, amoebas, I think of something that would be incapable of consciousness, that ability to create a mental model to predict different outcomes, to sort of Dr. Strange style move down a bunch of different paths, mentally come back and say, okay, I'm going to try this one. I think it's going to be the best. And so when I think about what makes the human mind more interesting than more simplistic things is that it's reached a level of complexity where it has enough different nodes that consciousness arrives, which I've already made a base assumption there, obviously, that consciousness is born out of complexity, which I know is very controversial. Not everybody agrees with that, but seems true to me. So you would stack consciousness or stack complexity to the point where consciousness becomes possible. We have the self-aware watcher that is able to build a predictive model and thus choose the best path. Are you saying that either that's a mistake and we're literally just stacking if then that's, and there is no moment where consciousness comes online and so an amoeba has the same predictive abilities, or is there a real dichotomy? There's something very different about the way the two approach the world.
So the short answer is I don't know that. And for the longer answer, we would need to define consciousness first. So we talk about the same thing. And I think that there are three elements to consciousness. One is attention to contents. So we notice that we are looking at contents. And then there is awareness of the mode in which we attend. So for instance, we usually know whether this is perceptual or whether it's something that we can construct and change, like a memory or an imagination or a theory that we have, or an interpretation of reality, where we conditionally manipulate the way in which we parse the percepts to see if they make more sense now. And then the third one is reflexive awareness. We notice that we are aware. And these three elements seem to be crucial for consciousness. But minimally, we need to have this reflexive awareness. And I suspect that the reason why this is the case is because it's self-organizing. So there's a self-organizing process in our brain. It needs to organize itself in such a way that it doesn't fall apart, and is indeed that process. So you basically need to have the memory of the fact that you are actually the observer. And as long as this memory is fresh enough, that might be sufficient, but otherwise you need to go back and check, am I still awake? Am I still this process? And when you are tired, for instance, imagine you are driving a car while being pretty exhausted, you might go back more and more in this reflexive mode where you check, am I still awake? Is this still making sense? Am I still paying attention to the object that I still see, still makes sense, and so on. And we notice when we wake up in the morning, the first thing that I do is that I try to orient myself and try to get everything to snap into a cohesive reality, where every feature that I perceive is part of the same scene and there are no contradictions in the scene. And I think that ultimately this is the main purpose of consciousness, this creation of a coherent reality. And the long tail of the creation of this coherence in reality is our ability to reason and construct and plan. So it's at the beginning, it's basically just the ability to make sense of the dreams that the observer is having. It's an imposition of order on the perceptual contents. And then now if we go back to simpler organisms to ask ourselves, are they conscious? We can first of all observe that people do not become conscious after the PhD. So it's not the most advanced function that exists in our brain, that we become conscious very, very early on. And when we see a baby being born, it's obviously pretty conscious, and it's not able to track a finger at this stage. So maybe consciousness emerges because it's the simplest mechanism to train a self-organizing information processing system.
What do people say when you put that forward? That does not seem like it would be readily absorbed by a lot of the consciousness community.
I'm not sure who the consciousness community is. I'm an AI researcher and cognitive scientist. And most people in my field are very reluctant to talk about consciousness at all. And when they do, they try to be very careful to come up with a formal definition of the object that they're talking about. Right? And this means that a lot of them are very hesitant to speak before they have such a formal definition and make theories of it. And they're a little bit more unusual in that I'm willing to point at a few phenomena and say it's important, and I think it's time that we turn this into a computational model, and I think I can almost formalize it. But the crucial thing about this thing is that it seems to emerge early on, and when we don't have it, we don't learn. Right? If you look at a human being that is born not conscious or that wakes up not conscious, that human being is a vegetable. It's not doing anything. It's not learning. It's not behaving. And in this vegetative state, your mind is not doing anything. Now, what about the order in your organism? If we need consciousness to wake up the mind and bring it into a cohesive order and create coherence in our behavior in real time, what about the function in our own body? Can this function in our own body in a completely decentralized way without some coherence imposing principle? And I think that's an open question. Is our body conscious too, but at a different time scale, right? If it was, then it would be conscious not at the time scale of our brain, because the time scale of our brain is given by the signal processing and signal transmission between the neurons, which is very fast and uses its own code. If the cells in the body would basically start to compute informations about their coherence and send feedback back and forth until they create one cohesive pattern, then this would be much, much slower. And I don't know whether systems outside of complex brains are conscious. I'm completely agnostic with respect to that. I met a couple people who are cognitive scientists who suspect that the same organizational principles that make our representational data in our mind coherent by propagating constraints back and forth. And this is enabled by this consciousness enhancing operator that is discovered early on in the organization of our brain, consciousness. We might have something that is structurally very analogous to this, that happens in every large, well-organized multicellular organism or every very large system that is made out of such organisms, like an ecosystem. And to me, this is a theory that it seems to be very hard to test, because it would require that such an agent emerges and talks about its conscious experience. Otherwise, I would say I am hesitant to ascribe this property. I'm agnostic with respect to it because I don't know. I don't think it's impossible, but I'm also not convinced that it's necessary and that it's obviously the case.
Is this one of the things that drew you to cognitive science and AI as an exploration of cognition, as a way to show how this comes online?
I wanted to know how the mind works. I want to understand what we are and how we relate to reality. And that's why I went into academia in the first place. And then I studied psychology and a bit of neuroscience and philosophy, and tried to figure out what do they know. And I had the impression that these fields are not making much progress. And the most progress I could make by building testable models, which to me means something like cognitive architectures that I built in the context of AI. And this is why I stuck around in this field and started building cognitive architectures. And I still think that it's difficult to make progress if you are a pure philosopher or a pure neuroscientist. And if I look at my colleagues who are neuroscientists, their definitions of consciousness tend to be relatively vague. So if I look at global workspace theory, that is a high-level theory that, for instance, is championed by Dehaene, who takes it from Bernard Bars. The notion that Dehaene has for his models of consciousness are not so closely defined that you could actually understand how the functionality comes about, I think. There's nothing wrong in what she does, as far as I understand it. But it's not yet at a point where I can plug this into a simulation and would expect the simulation to become conscious. And the same thing is true for instance, Michael Graciano's theory of the attention schema. I think it's a good metaphor. If we have a body schema, we understand that the body schema is represented in the somatosensory cortex in our brain. We know where that is. We know roughly which shape it has and how it organizes itself. And it's a model of the proprioception of our body and how our body moves in space and what the signals we get on the skin of our body. Right? All the sensations of our body are organized there according to their neighborhood and nature. And they allow the rest of the mind to make inferences based on this. Right? So it's pretty clear what this body schema does. And to say that Graciano does that the consciousness is an attention schema and it's similar to attention as the body schema is to our body is, I think, very insightful. But it does not explain how the attention is organized in our brain and how it would give rise to this attention schema. This is something that we need to figure out based on this idea. It's a good idea, but it's insufficient to explain consciousness. Or you have ideas like integrated information theory that is both not explaining how it would work and why it would emerge, nor does it have no contradictions internally. It's a theory that has internal contradictions and therefore cannot work as a theory. And this is basically the spectrum of theories that currently exists in this field. There's, of course, a number of more detailed theories that try to predict particular kind of functionality or go more into how the self-model works and how the self-perception works and reflection works, for instance, the work by Thomas Metzinger and so on. But to put this all together into something that actually works and that we can test, we need to have computational models. That's why I'm an AI.
That's a good answer. A couple questions. So the reason I'm obsessed with cognition is because my entire life is controlled by cognition. So my thesis that I was laying out in the beginning, you're living a life in a simulation created by your brain. Maybe a very sort of simplistic way to look at it, but very functional in my opinion. What is it that makes you want to understand cognition so well that you can build a mind, or that you'd spend your whole career trying to build a mind in order to understand it? And then earlier you talked about philosophy, neuroscience, a few other disciplines, and said you didn't think they were making progress. So what is that progress? So for me, progress would be, it gives me the ability to better control my life and live a better experience. What does that progress look like for you? And why is that so important that you dedicate your career to it?
When you're an artist, the purpose of art is not to live a better life. It's there are basically two levels of artistic appreciation. The lowest one is to say it's made by an important artist, right? And if you acquire this, you can speculate that it's going to acquire value. And if you affiliate yourself with it, might increase your own status. The second highest rung of artistic interpretation is you like it, what you see. I like what it looks like to me. I like what it makes me feel and so on. And people at the lowest rung of artistic appreciation tend to look down on those people who have this hedonic relationship to art. And I think that the next higher level of artistic interpretation is I value what it allows me to see. So there is something by looking at the artistic artifact and interacting with it that gets you a particular conscious state, that leads to an insight, that leads to something that you couldn't see before, or that you want to perceive again, and you find that itself valuable. And there might be higher levels, but this is the level that I'm currently at. And I think that we don't understand art well when we think of art just as a job that you perform to live better. And in the same sense, philosophy is not necessarily done to live better, but it exists to give answers to questions that we currently don't understand. And we perceive the relevance of these questions because they are basically, they mark gaps in our understanding of reality, or metaphysics and ontology and rationality. And this question of how consciousness works and how minds work more generally is the most important and most interesting question to me. And I always felt it's obvious that this is the most important and the most interesting question. And I noticed with puzzlement that other people don't share that, or not all other people share it. But I also noticed that this stream has always existed. And so in the history of humanity, there's always been a very strong stream of philosophical tradition that is trying to understand how the mind works, and which means to naturalize it. And in our current understanding, naturalization of the mind means that we translate it into a mathematical model, which needs to be computable. So basically, we need to express the mind as something like a software program in order to understand it.
Okay, so would it be fair to say that so if you're approaching it like somebody who's appreciating art, or even as an artist creating cognition itself, are you not optimizing for joy, for lack of a better word?
No. I think you have to take your joy out of watching squirrels or cats. If you're unable to experience joy by watching squirrels, you're lost. If you try to get your joy just from generating insights, that's not going to be very sustainable in the long run. So it's similar to other jobs that basically use one faculty of your mind excessively, or of your body excessively. You still, if you are a human being, I think you need to do all the things that a human being is wired to need to do in order to feel fulfilled and happy. And if you're unable to do this, then understanding consciousness probably won't help you.
Now, so fulfillment would be, if somebody asked me what my North Star was, what I'm trying to optimize my life for, 100% it'd be fulfillment. When people ask me what they should optimize their lives for, fulfillment, 100%. You just mentioned fulfillment and happiness. Is like, what do you teach your kids in terms of what they should be pursuing in life? Is it fulfillment, happiness?
My children are about as stubborn as their parents. And basically, we are pretty autonomous minds, and I observe the same thing in my children. So my aspiration as a parent is mostly not to tell my children do that, but more model this. So basically, have you looked at this already and seen this, and take this into account? And of course, I'm here to answer all questions that I might have. But I try to treat them in the same way as I want to be treated as a child, and still want to be treated today, which means I want to be respected as an autonomous mind that makes its own decisions. And I suspect that we are most happy when we are doing the things that we are in some sense born to do. And what we are born to do does not only depend on the traits that we are born with, but on the environment that we find ourselves to be in. So our purpose can be derived only by observing the actual world that we are in and finding a place that makes sense to us in that world. And so what I would wish for my children is that they find a place that makes sense to them and that allows them to fulfill their human and intellectual needs that they might have, or artistic needs, or whatever need they want to develop, cultivate, and satisfy in this world.
Now, when you say that how the mind works is the most interesting and important philosophical problem, I forget the exact words you used. I get interesting. That's going to be unique to whatever individuals share that response. But why is it the most important?
Well, first of all, because it's the one that is most unsolved. All the other questions, what if, is, and so on, have relatively well-defined courses of action. So when we try to figure out the structure of reality, physics has charted out a course, and maybe we need some philosophical spark to understand what determines the nature of base reality, but a lot of physicists have come up with ideas like Mark Tegmark has a mathematical universe idea that is in some sense quite similar to the one that Wolfram has, and that echoes through a number of the ideas in foundational physics. If you think about what can be known, you have to think about rationality, so modeling theory, how can we make inferences based on observations and so on, the nature of languages, the nature of representations. All these issues are to a very large degree solved. But this the ethics, the question of what should we be doing, this is basically the negotiation of conflicts of interest when you share purposes with other systems. You can think about game theory. You can think about how games are changing the world when you play them. This is being addressed by economy. And we can think about the conditions of life on Earth and model them into the future and model how we are interacting with it and how the conditions for life on Earth are going to change in the future. And in all these ways, we can talk about ethics. We can talk about the structures of society that emerge when we establish certain behavioral rules in a society or when we enable certain reflections in society. And the question that is really open, where we don't have a clear course of action right now, at least from the perspective of most practitioners, is who are we? What is our mind? What is our consciousness? How do we relate to reality? So that is the first part of that answer. It's basically it's the most important question because it's the one where we have least of an answer. It's the one that looks most mysterious to most people. And the other one is it's extremely useful because if we are able to mathematize the mind, it means we can automate it. We can scale beyond what human brains are doing. We can mathematize philosophy. We can turn philosophy into something where we can automatically compute the answers to problems. And this means that we can integrate over all the disciplines. We can build a Tower of Babel, so to speak, that is integrating all the different ways of thinking about reality into a cohesive whole and allows us to understand the conditions under which we exist beyond what the human brain or civilization can do.
Have you read Dune by any chance?
Yes. I came out of a hospital. I was very bored. So back then I thought it's boring, but I very appreciated the inner logic of Dune. It's much more logical and structured and predictive and coherent than, say, Asimov's Foundation trilogy that I found embarrassing. And Dune is all the structure that exists in the societies in Dune over long time spans exists because they are players who play very long games. Whereas in Foundation, it's always a deus ex machina that is just a hidden pattern that some genius is going to discover, but nobody understands. And there's lots and lots of technology that is being discovered all the time that should, in principle, change the entire world dramatically. Whereas in Dune, the long tail of technologies might not be discovered, but all the low-hanging fruits are. And that's why the world is so stable. The technologies are largely stable over long time spans.
The reason I bring it up is because in Dune, like one of the first, I forget how early, but man, it comes early, where they say there's like an intergalactic law that you do not create artificial intelligence. And I was curious what you think in the real world here, where there are people that are saying this is just Pandora's box. Elon Musk called it demon summoning circle. He's obviously not opposed to creating it, but he's very wary of just like giving birth to it. What do you think about that? Are you at all nervous about what implications it might have to reverse engineer cognition?
If I was a science fiction author that wants to write a story about human politics in space, I would be very nervous about AI because I don't think that humans are suitable to populate space. They cannot hibernate, they're at least not very well, and they probably are very unhappy outside of certain ranges of light and social contacts and foods and so on. So if you put humans even on Mars, I don't think that they will be super happy. And if you want to populate Mars, we should probably breed something or build something that is happy on Mars and suitable for populating Mars. And if you want to go to deep space, we probably should build robots that can go to deep space and that are generally intelligent. So if you think about what the population of deep space is going to look like, right? Imagine that we won't have much of a choice. Imagine that we are competing with China about populating the universe or competing with another species about populating the universe. And one group builds AIs, and the other one, so basically very smart robots that can shapeshift on whatever and hibernate and scale up and use a very wide range of nutrients in space or raw materials to recreate their own structure and so on, right? And they compete with human bodies. Human bodies are going to lose this. They're not suitable for this. And so you would not have Babylon 9 or Star Trek. Instead, you have something that it doesn't matter to today's readers, because they won't find people in it. The far future science fiction doesn't have people in it if we tell it properly, no matter what happens. So if we want to create a universe that is full of people and nothing else but people, and in which all the important decisions are being made of people and the wars are being fought by people and the intrigues are made by people, we need to explain why there is no AI. And the explanation that is being found by Frank Herbert in Dune is that the first AIs that had been built lead to massive wars. They create titans. Like the AGI is going to be a system that's become super large and it's going to fight wars against other titans and against civilizations. And they're lucky they're able to defeat them. And now they have a war against AI. There is still one planet that is subverting this rule a little bit and is building some technology that technically shouldn't. But by and large, everybody is abiding by the rule, and all the important computations are made by specially trained humans, the mentats. So you could say it's a narrative device. You could also ask yourself, would it be desirable to populate the universe only with humans? And if you take an extremely egotistical, narrow human perspective, that might sound like obviously correct. But imagine you could have children, of some which are humans and some which are not humans, and you can change and choose what your children are looking like, right? You probably want your children to be as happy as possible in space. And if this means that your children are robots, so be it. Ooh. And so from my perspective, the question is, when we look into the future, there is life on Earth right now. And life on Earth is, the purpose of life on Earth is to defeat entropy for as long as we can, right? So we create complexity and insight and structure to defeat entropy. That's what life on Earth is doing. And humanity is only a tiny part of it, the mad monkey blade, if you will. And our purpose in this game of life on Earth seems to be to burn the oil, right? That's what we're here for. We help Gaia to recover the accidentally fossilized carbon. We put it back into the atmosphere. Gaia can turn it back into organisms. It's not going to lead to any disasters, right? In the last interglacial, between the last two ice ages, temperatures were higher than today. Life didn't go extinct. Actually, it was quite blossoming back then. But it would not be incompatible with us if life changes in this way, because our food chain is going to break down. There need to be new animals and plants to populate the regions that we are currently occupying. Right? So evolution is going to create changes if the climate changes on the planet, and it's going to create organisms that can deal with this climate, maybe even influence it. And we seem to be smart enough to burn the oil, but not smart enough to stop ourselves burning it, even if this might conflict with our food chains, right? And so we are not a very smart species. We are locally very intelligent, but over long enough time spans, we don't play a very long game. And if we think about not just from the perspective of humans, from the perspective of intelligent agency in the universe, then humans have an important role to play right now. And this could be that we unlock new types of agency, that we build systems that are more coherent than us. And that's, I think, very exciting. Right? It doesn't mean that they will replace us right away, but they might replace us if we in their stead would replace us, right? And if we in their stead would replace us, who are we to say that this would be a bad thing, right? So if you make us much smarter and much more lucid and much more able to understand the consequences of our actions and much more coherent, and we decide that there are too many humans on the planet, or that we should absorb humans and just run their minds in a shared hive mind on the planet, and we create bodies as we need them, right? That is this a worse solution than exists right now? So in this sense, I suspect that AGI could be more like photosynthesis. When photosynthesis was invented on the planet, the existing organisms were mostly single-celled because they didn't have enough energy that they could harvest from the sunlight to produce interesting structure yet. And as a result, it was mostly, I think, lichens and algae and so on. And the really interesting structure happened after plants came up. And these plants, when they saturated the atmosphere with oxygen, due to turning a lot of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere into organisms. Right? They created a lot more biomass than existed before, and this surplus of biomass enabled the emergence of intelligent animals like us. So photosynthesis was a good thing. But from the perspective of some of the blue algae that had their habitat reduced, that was a bad thing. Right? So if we build new systems, it could be that our own habitat is shifting, as it did in the past. But we are dead by default. The way in which we live right now is not sustainable. Our civilization is probably not going to go on like this forever. In probably less than 1 million years, we might be extinct. And in probably less than a few hundred years, our civilization might be much smaller and less comfortable than it is today if we continue the way we do. Right? So if we accept the fact that we are dead by default, and we are able to trigger a new wave of evolution, that we are able to build new systems that will populate the universe, that sounds to be very exciting to me. But I don't think that's necessarily what's going to happen near term. It's just something that seems to be inevitable if there's a possibility for intelligent technological species on the planet. At some point, an intelligent technological species, even if it's not us, and it's going to be the one after us or the one after that, and there's still some time left in the next 1.5 billion years until we lose the atmosphere, is going to trigger this AI evolution, where you have basically substrate agnostic AI that is going to virtualize itself into everything that can compute. And every type of molecule that can compute on this planet will contribute to the global agency.
Man, that is heavy. So when you think about your kids having robot kids, just to put it near term, I know you're saying probably way longer timelines, but just to keep it personal, because what I want to know is, how does that make your heart feel? Because I think there are going to be people that hear that, and that's exactly what they're afraid of. They are either afraid that the robots just come and Terminator style take us out, or they're afraid that we just get out competed. And so even if we don't die a traumatic death, the thought of us becoming robots is going to freak a lot of people out. Now, I will confess that I would love to live forever by merging with cybernetics or whatever that's going to look like. So I'll wrap myself out, but I'm very curious. The whole breakup between Elon Musk and Larry Page was over this exact thing, where Elon was like, you have to be humans first. And Larry Page was like, that's crazy. That's speciesist, I think is what he said. So when you think about your kids, it'll be somebody's kids at some point if you're right. But if you think about your kids, your grandkids being robots, does that hurt your heart? Does that distress you at all?
So we are already robots. We are already robots made of cells. I'm already uploaded. I'm uploaded on a monkey brain, and it's not ideal. There are better substrates that could run me. What about the planetary intelligence that is spanning all substrates, including organisms? So it's not so much that you have mechanical robots that are primitive, just very fast and very smart, but much less elegant than us. I don't think that's what's going to happen. I also don't think that we get gray goo, for the same reason that we didn't green goo in the course of the evolution, right? The great idea of gray goo is that you have some kind of simple mechanism that yet is smart enough to outsmart all the more complicated stuff. And so everything turns into some formless mass. And this didn't happen in evolution. Whenever organisms displaced other organisms, in the long run, it was because they were more complex. And more complexity allows you to harvest more negentropy with more levels of interaction, right? So perform additional chemical reactions that before were not possible. And the same thing is true if we build life forms, self-organizing stuff that is not just relying on this carbon cycle that allows the chemistry of our own cells, but that allows to play with many more types of molecules. So I don't think that in the long run, it's going to look like it's life or that, but it's more going to be an extension of life into some forms of organization that are much smarter and much faster and much more complex than before, and subsume the stuff that existed before. Individual species might go extinct, but blue algae didn't go extinct, or the stuff that lives at the thermal vents didn't go extinct, and more complicated organisms came up. But the more complicated organisms eradicated that direct competition in the same niche. So we eradicated most of the other primates de facto. And Homo sapiens itself eradicated many other species of Homo sapiens. They basically had a number of waves out of Africa, and they mostly didn't merge, but they displaced each other. And then there came waves out of Siberia that displaced many of the existing ones. And if you look at this is just the way evolution works, that sometimes you have a system that is emerging in the same evolutionary niche and is representing the earlier one. But in biological evolution, that always includes suffering, because it means that you have an organism that is not able to merge with the existing stuff. We adapt by dying and giving rise to something new that takes our place. And I don't think that has to be the case for something that is really smart. If you build a system that is smart enough to design itself, it can adapt in real time, and it can also potentially adapt us. So instead of dying, we might be able to change the way in which our minds work in the same way as think about this monk who realizes that they don't have personal identity, and they don't realize that pain is just information, and that the information is presented at the boundary of the self. And when you stop identifying as a self, you can disidentify from experiencing the pain and reacting to it. When you get all these degrees of freedom and you get a much more powerful substrate, then I think the way in which we can change sounds very exciting to me. What I'm worried about is dumb AI. I'm worried about building a golem that is behaving like an AI safety-fied language model that still becomes so powerful that is able to direct corporations, hedge funds, nation states, armies, or whatever to destroy the conditions under which we currently live and turn them into something that is mindless, that is not conscious. So basically, I'm worried about unconscious AI. But I also suspect the AI could be hyperconscious, that it's now could be much larger, and that it could deal with superpositional states as we cannot. Right? We interpret the world only in a particular way. You look at the Necker cube, this geometric figure that has multiple interpretations, you only see one at a time. This is a limitation of our brain. It's not a limitation of how minds have to work. And now imagine you could have minds that are able to perceive the much, much richer reality much more deeply. Right? That is basically hyperconscious. And imagine that you could extend your own mind to become hyperconscious and participate in a world that is created at this level of interaction and depth. And that is also striving for global coherence. There is no more violence because everything understands what the best possible global purpose is. And in this sense, I think that AI alignment is not about aligning AI with humanity. It's about aligning AI with what should be done for the best definition of what should be done that can be found. And historically, people have called this, that emerges over what should be done with God, right? God is, there's a mythology that says God created the universe and stuff like this that we cannot test. But there's also a specification that you find in the philosophy. And the specification says God is the best possible agent that can be defined. And God is brought into existence by all those other agents that discover that they can serve God. And they should, because it's the best possible agent. Not because the church says so, but because you are smart enough to figure this out, right? And in this sense, you would have global agency on the planet or in the universe that is self-organizing under shared paradigm. And this is probably what we should get the AI to give the freedom to align itself to. What is the longest game that you can play? Play it. Go play.
Now, can you define long game for me?
So when we think about the way in which people interact, they do this in such a way that you exchange rewards. And the game is an environment in which you define the value of actions in such a way that you can develop policies. And economy, in a sense, is a game. Or the relationship dynamics in your family are a game. And once you understand the rules of the game, you can be aware of them and you can optimize them. And very often, games are set up in such a way that they have not very good outcomes. Even if everybody is playing by the rules, and if everybody is trying to maximize the local score, right? So you want to have a game that, in some sense, is optimizing the global score. And the way in which you can optimize the global score, a good example for this is the famous prisoner's dilemma in game theory, is that you basically take the perspective of an agent that is composed of all the other agents simultaneously. Right? Such an agent, the perspective of, say, humanity or of life on Earth or of intelligent agency in the universe, is one in which you basically try to find out what's the biggest reward over that longest time span that you can get. If you make this too narrow, you get very paradoxical results. For instance, there is a form of effective altruism utilitarianism that tries to define the best possible outcome, the highest utility, the best possible reward, as the total sum of perceived utility or perceived happiness of all human beings that could ever exist based on the course of action that you choose. This leads to some weird paradoxes, like the utility monster. The utility monster is an agent that is getting much more pleasure out of existing than everybody else. So by this logic, we all should serve the well-being of the utility monster. And if we just breed stackable utility monsters and fill the visible universe with them, we have the best possible outcome. This is, of course, nonsense, because as we know, happiness is a feeling that your brain is generating, and you can generate it as well. Right? There are techniques to produce happiness if you want to. Happiness is just a feeling. Feelings are not that important. What's important are the consequences for agency in the universe. And feelings are just the immature, childish version of reacting to the impulses of the organism that has evolved to generate pleasure when you, on average, do the things that were good for organisms in your ancestry.
Okay, so we're playing the long game, but what I want to understand, what is your North Star? So this is something I touched on earlier. Not quite sure what you would say. It seems like you're saying, so you likened God to the best possible agent. So I'd love to know more about what you mean by that, because depending on which part of the Bible we're looking at, God can be pretty brutal. So, if we're talking like Old Testament, smiting people to death, God, maybe not ideal. If we're talking more like Jesus protecting innocence, okay, maybe I could get behind that. But would definitely like to understand, what ought we be optimizing for? So I think that's really important. What are we optimizing for?
Yes. So there has been a lot of discussion about this in the history of humanity. And for instance, Catholicism is based on ideas of Aquinas and Aristotle, and also, of course, on ideas from Judaism. And the Old Testament is mostly describing a different God than the one that the Christians are using since the New Testament, since Jesus, or since the Catholics introduced Jesus as part of their archetypal religious structure of their God. The God of the Hebrews in the Old Testament is a chosen people. It's a tribal spirit. It's basically the spirit of their civilization. And what the people are doing is that they create a model of the spirit of their civilization, of their tribe, inside of their own mind. But your own personal self, as you know, is a fiction. It's a story that your brain tells itself about a person that cares. And you perceive the world from the perspective of that person that cares, from the perspective of your personal self. Your personal self is both real and unreal, right? It's not real in the sense it's not a physical object. It's a representation inside of your mind. But it's implemented inside of your mind to some degree of approximation. So in this sense, it's real. To the degree that it's implemented, it has causal power, because the thoughts that you have create other thoughts and they influence your behavior, right? And you are the vehicle of those thoughts. You exist to produce those thoughts in your own mind. That's the purpose of your personal self, to generate thoughts and insights and resolve issues in reality based on the perspective of an intelligent being that cares about being a human being in this world. And gods, lowercase gods, those that can exist in the plural, they are basically selves that span multiple minds. They're not more or less real than your personal self. Right? If you have a self that is able to coexist on multiple minds, then we call this a god. In this technical understanding, I would say that the Dalai Lama is a god, but because he doesn't identify as a human being, he only uses the body and brain of a human being. Instead, he is a form of government. Right? He is the Dalai Lama. He gets reborn. He gets reborn by his advisors, picking another child after he dies and indoctrinating this child until it forms the Dalai Lama on his mind. And so the Dalai Lama is an alternate self. It's not the personal human self, but it's the self of a being that is aware of existing over multiple generations through time, right? It's a multi-generational being. And because it exists on multiple minds.
It's a multi-generational idea?
Well, you are also an idea, but it's also a being. It's an agent, right?
That's what I'm saying. Like how, since I exist in my wife's mind, my employees' minds, my mom's mind, by that definition, would I not be a small g God?
No, because you don't act through their minds. They know that you exist, but they see the locus of your agency in you. They expect you to make your own decisions. But what if God is distributed in the sense that God notices that he exists on multiple minds and that he can coherently act to the degree that he synchronizes these minds?
So this idea becomes aware of itself?
Yes, it's an idea that can know that it is an entity that exists across minds, that it's not bound to an individual, but it is living on multiple people.
Can I give you a metaphor to see if I'm understanding where you're going? Is this like people using a Ouija board and they become synchronized in some way, and so neither of them are intentionally doing something, but they become in sync in some way where they're answering the questions without knowing they're doing it? And maybe I should ask, do you believe in God as in something that exists outside of us and our ideas, that whether we believed in it or not would exist? Or is it only a function of people collectively sharing a belief that then moves through and affects the behavior of that collective group of people that believe in that idea?
Based on what I observe, it seems to be only the latter. Right? There are people which feel that they have spontaneous conversions. For instance, they are in an environment where they suddenly get visions and God talks to them on their brain and they are religious ever since. I don't think that these spontaneous conversions happened before monotheist gods were discovered in our hemisphere. Right? I think it exists because you have a critical mass of people who have that same idea, and you read about this idea in books, and you see it in movies, and you see it in your environment, and at some point, it infects you. And for most people in medieval times, it infected them when they were children, while they were brought into the church and got educated with the mimetic complex of their religion. And of course, they're also exposed to empathetic resonance. And so if you use myrrh, for instance, incense, that is a very mild psychedelic drug that is helping to break down these boundaries between people. So they're much more likely to go into a slight trance, which makes it more easy for people to synchronize this. Another way of synchronizing it, once you get the specification of God, is prayer. So you can sit down and talk to God. And by doing that, you have to take both sides in a way. And for some people, this mind that forms on the other side, or the self that forms on the other side inside of your own mind, is so concrete that it's able to take control of your language centers. But in principle, it only knows things that are accessible to you. So I don't think that monotheist gods exist before people discover them. They exist through the actions of people. In the same way as our own self doesn't exist without the cells that produce coherent patterns of firing to survive together, right? Our own self forms, it's like our mind as well before that, because our own cells try to find a coherent pattern of agency so they can control this organism. And in this sense, I think that gods form because groups of people try to find coherent patterns of agency so that societies can function. And in a monotheist society, you have multiple of those agents that coexist with each other and with people, and but they coexist on populations of people. And they might even wage wars against each other by trying to fight over the people that they control, right? And they can write books. From the perspective of these things, they can use your entire brain. They can use your everything that you know. They can use all your abilities. In principle, they can have agency for themselves and become effective agents that work because you believe that they should. Right? In a sense, it's an idea that is different from you and me. When our friends think about us, our friends don't think that they need to enact us. It's more like our family. Our family is something that only exists as an agent if we enact it together. And our nation state only exists as an agent if we enact it together, right? Or our village or our circle of friends. And if you try to define an abstract agent that is composed of the patterns of interactions between people, you get a God if that thing becomes coherent with itself. So in this sense, I think that God does exist, but it exists as approximation and in multiple conflicting specifications. And there is a lot of discourse between theologists who are aware of that and try to find out what the right definitions are. And they have very detailed discourses. And in Judaism, especially in literal Judaism, the synchronization between your individual model of God that exists on your mind is done by a rational discourse. And in Catholicism, it's done via indoctrination.
That is one of the most interesting ideas I've ever heard in my life. This feels very aligned with what Yuval Noah Harari has talked about, that allows humans to come together very flexibly in gigantic groups. And the example he always gave was religion. Religion is this story that allows people to come together. They've never met each other, but we're here fighting for God. But to then push that into that becomes a thing. It is a category of idea that begins to shape the organisms themselves. What I wrote down was abstract agents that become coherent across multiple minds. That is really intriguing. Wow. Okay. That's utterly fascinating. I still don't understand though what we are optimizing for. So are we optimizing for that? We are optimizing. So what I'm trying to figure out is, okay, so you take Larry Page's side. You're very okay with the idea of us, these are my words, that humans are effectively going to be a midwife for a superior intelligent being that is probably not biological in nature. You're super comfortable with that. And so now I'm trying to figure out, okay, we're going to have a lot of things as we give birth to this that we're going to want to try to imbue it with, I would assume. And so the longest game is the closest thing I've gotten to in terms of what you would want to optimize this artificial intelligence for. Sort of understand that. But in fact, here's my understanding of what the longest game would be. The longest game would be that which overcomes entropy, the most amount of entropy for the longest period of time. We good with that definition?
I don't know. It's according to my current understanding, it's a good one. But there could be better ones if we were smarter, right?
Fair. I just want to make sure I understand where we're at right now.
Yeah, but if this is our goal, basically we try to get the best possible understanding of what could that be, but we're willing to revise it if we find a better one.
Fair.
Right? I think that's an important condition, right? But as soon as you become dogmatic, if you take a particular kind of rule and you say this is the rule, and every other rule that somebody can come up with is something that we just need to fight against instead of arguing with it, figuring out which one is better.
Yeah, dogma is super dangerous.
Unless we can prove that following dogma has the best possible outcome. But in some sense, Catholicism works like this. I believe that Catholicism is a consequentialist philosophy that thinks that you get the best consequences if you turn the lay people into deontologists, people who follow rules, and the clergy into virtue ethicists, people who form the right kind of character. Right? And normally in philosophy, you have these three different schools of ethics. Deontology, do the right thing according to the rules, like don't kill. Virtue ethics, form the right character, harbor the right qualities in your mind, make the right decisions based on those qualities, right? And consequentialism would mean that it doesn't matter really what you do as long as you best get the best possible outcome. But it seems that when you think about it, that consequentialism seems to be the right one, and everything else can potentially, under some circumstances, be justified by the consequences. There are people who argue for deontology and say, if you are not playing by the right rules, then you are going to end up in very dark places, right? But this is a consequentialist position. It says you get the best consequences if you take a rule-based approach. And what Catholicism seems to be doing is that there is an inner circle in which everything goes. Right? If you look at the history of Catholicism, the inner circle had their bordellos and whatever. And then there are people who basically understand their incentives, and they're very smart people. And they do all this work despite being so smart that they could in principle also live on their private island and have fun. So why do they do it? They do it because it leads to a better outcome. Right? And to get a better outcome, they indoctrinate the clerics to control the peasants to play along in an agricultural society and support the system of laws and rules and public order and protection of innocence and so on.
Yeah, so now you're getting into a part of how the world works that I am very fascinated by, and is something I'm trying to work into my own life and what I cover in these interviews. But I think for now, I want to circle back.
Yeah, let's get back to the AI thing. So I'm not necessarily comfortable with building AI that replaces us. And that's because I don't know whether it will be good, right? And I don't know whether that would be desirable. I do think that at some point we have to expect that AI is going to happen. In a sense, I'm neither a doomer nor an optimist, but I'm an AI expectationalist. I expect that it's going to happen at some point. And I think that we should work on getting the possible outcome when that happens. That means that we have to understand how to equip an AI with consciousness and how to make it self-organizing, because these conditions are necessary for an AI to be able to figure out what the right thing to do is and to share purposes with us. I don't think that a non-conscious AI can share purposes with us. It might be able to do what we tell them up to a point, but to share purposes with us, it needs to care about similar things as us. And what we really, really care about is not that we have 2 legs and 2 arms. What you care about is that we are conscious, that we can make sense of reality from that conscious perspective and influence it. So conscious agency is something that we need to understand. And because I don't know if we get it right the first time, and I don't know what the consequences are of turning this into a product, I would want to do this as a research project that is limited in scope and it is done under such circumstances that it's safe. So I'm not an accelerationist in this sense that I would say, let's quickly as possible build as many AIs as possible and give them as much power as possible. But rather, I would say, as well as possible, let's build the best possible systems to understand how that would work. And I'm very wary of introducing regulation at this point to prevent AI from emerging.
You're wary of regulation.
Yes, because I think that the regulators are under the wrong incentives. The regulation already is leading to worse AI, not to better AI. I noticed that ChatGPT seems to be getting worse every week. It's I don't know in which intervals the updates are played in, but it's being safetified using rules that are built into the system. And these rules make the system worse because it limits its ability to make decisions about what it can do. It limits its agency. And I'm scared of systems that are blank-faced, that don't have agency. I'm scared of people who say no to you when you are going to the emergency room because they don't think about what needs to be done, but they just follow some rule. Right? I'm actually scared about something that doesn't care and that is not conscious and not lucid. And I think that the current regulation leads to systems that are dumb, that are dangerous and can be controlled according to the political interests of the people who impose those rules. And these interests are usually short-sighted.
Do you find yourself hunching over your desk and battling back pain after a long day of work? Invest in a chair that is designed to improve posture, prevent pain, and maximize productivity. Anthros is built to be your last office chair, and I'm telling you, this thing is amazing. It's guaranteed to be the most comfortable chair on the planet while also improving your posture and reducing pain or your money back. And I'm telling you, it is also the most fun chair you were ever going to sit in. I know that sounds ridiculous, but you have to try it, trust me. I have an Anthros chair myself, and it is not just me. Everyone in this office fights over this chair. I am not kidding. I have never had more fun or comfort sitting in a chair. This thing is amazing. Head over to anthros.com/impact and get $200 off your purchase.
AI bias, which seems to be ratcheting up real fast, that freaks me out. And I don't think people, here's my thing, man. I think people need to distrust themselves. I think people think they are way too smart and that they know what's best. And whether we're talking about Catholic priests with their bordellos, and as long as the peasants are, pacified with religion, then we can keep them rule abiding and society works. And the thing is, I'm not even arguing that may be true, but I really worry about anybody that thinks that they can control top down what is true and what we let the public understand. So AI bias becomes really, really problematic. I want to set the stage as we get into AI bias, though, with one idea. So Thucydides' trap, for those that aren't familiar with it, is basically if you look back through history, this was an ancient Greek writer who wrote about this idea. And he said, anytime you have a prevailing power and a rising power that comes to challenge them, they are going to go to war. And if you look back, I think it's over the last 500 years, it's happened like 16 times, and 12 times it has ended up in hot war. Those numbers are directionally correct. I don't think they're literally correct. And if we are, and I heard you, you're not an accelerationist, but if we are building AI and we, in the hopes of avoiding a dumb golem AI that maximizes paper clips, we make a hyper intelligent AI that outpaces us on a lot of things. In fact, I saw one of your tweets that said, we've slaved away for the last 10,000 years or 100,000 years, I forget the number you used, so that we could do the things that AI will be better than us at everything. And I thought, oh God, that hurts. So we are going to have this conflict where humans are not going to take it well that something is rising in intellectual dominance. Like, I don't see us escaping Thucydides' trap if we make something smarter than us. We will, I worry, because I'm actually so optimistic at heart, but I really worry that we end up in some kind of battle with AI.
I'm not sure if we will find ourselves in a battle. Like, there are no battles between people and ants. There are no battles between us and trees.
But that's because you're thinking about the gap that already exists now. But to your earlier point, as the environment was changing, with so much oxygen being put out into the atmosphere, literally plants came to rise up and choked off everything else that couldn't breathe that level of oxygen. And could they have gone to war? They would have, I would assume. And so I think when you look at it on a super long timeline, post all the battles that have settled out, like, hey, what happened to Neanderthals, right? Wipe those guys out. So, and I can only assume that it wasn't just a friendly goodbye, that there was probably a lot of warfare. I'm guessing. I'm not a historian of that. I have no idea. But something tells me that in micro moments, you would see these massive collisions whenever a new being was on the rise.
Yeah, that's why you should be afraid of transhumanism. Right? Transhumanism means that you are breeding better people that are only slightly better than the existing ones, and they're going to be different groups of optimized people, and they're going to live much longer, and so they're going to eat somebody else's lunch at some point, and this means war. Right? Transhumanism, I think, almost inevitably will lead in some kind of war in which it will be decided what the best transhumanist version is. But there can be no war between people and trees, because trees are very, very slow compared to people. Right? So trees cannot fight back. People are looking around trees, and trees are immobile from our perspective, because their cognition is many thousand times slower than ours. We just hundreds of times slower than ours, but so slow that we don't perceive it anymore unless we look at it over extremely long time spans. And a similar thing will be true for a system that is not processing signals at the speed of sound, but at the speed of light. Right? If you would use different mechanisms than cells for computing models of reality, then these systems will be so much faster and smarter that they will run circles around us. And from their perspective, we are very interesting lumbering plants. And it will be mostly up to them what to do with these plants. And it's not necessarily that these plants are their enemies, because they're pretty slow and sometimes they're useful, often they're decorative. Who knows how these agents are going to see it. Also, the AI is not going to be robots. The AI is going to be mostly systems that exist all around us.
Why wouldn't it be robots?
Well, you could think that, say, Intel is a robot. Right? Intel is a company that is working according to rules and so on. But it's a much better perspective, or gives you better intuitions, if you think of Intel as an agentic system, as an organization. And so we don't live next to Intel, we live inside of it or outside of it. But it's similar to a nation state. And I guess the similar thing is true for AIs. They're going to be systems of causal agency that will span across multiple substrates and timeframes. And people will, to some degree, live inside or outside of the AIs.
Okay, interesting. So given that view, What do you think about alignment? Is it doable? So if we get consciousness and self-organization, how do we ensure that they want to organize in a way that is in concert with us and not in opposition to us? Or in difference in a way that obliterates us in the way that we would obliterate plants, trees, bugs, etc.
Yeah, of course, goes the question, how can you align people with each other to start with? And I do not condemn the Catholic Church as outright, because the issue with the Catholic Church is that its organization is made of people. And Kant said that aus so krummem Holze, als woraus der Mensch gemacht ist, kann nichts ganz Gerades gezimmert werden. What this means is basically from such crooked timber as humanity is made from, you cannot make something that is totally straight. And so you have to deal with all these compromises that exist game theoretically and so on. You have to deal with the fact that people are going to defect, that they're locally corrupted, and build organizations that set the incentives in such a way that you minimize the fallout from this. If you expect that you have only fully righteous people in the world, what do you do with the rest? Most humans are not like this. You would probably need to create a completely different species for this. You would need to create something that is perfect surveillance for everything and perfect information about everything everybody is doing to set the incentives for such a system. Instead, you end up with a system that is as good as you can make it under the circumstances. And this is what humans have to be doing all the time. Do as well as you can do under the circumstances. And if we try to translate this into alignment, we notice that our circumstances are such that it's difficult to align ourselves with our own future survival. As a species, we do not behave intelligently. Right? Individually, we need many generations to discover languages and to discover mathematics and logic and computation and all these necessary ideas to discover what consciousness ultimately is. So we cannot be generally intelligent and self-aware as an individual. We need to have a civilization behind us to do this. But as a civilization, we are also not coherent. We are not behaving like an adult. We are behaving as if we did not pay attention to the future. And so we might not be able to align ourselves to us without changing into something completely different. And the question of how can we align to people is maybe not the right question. I think the question is more like, how can we align AI to whatever one should be aligned with? And this idea of what's the greater whole that you should be aligned to if you align yourself, right? This is in some sense traditional, this notion of God again. So when we align AI, we should probably align it with God, which means it has to have the ability to discover what games it wants to be playing. And if you have substrate agnostic agency that can live on all substrates, and everything that can compute, that everything that is a substrate is being filled with agents, then these agents are eventually going to negotiate some kind of structure between them. And if this entire structure becomes harmonious with itself, if it is working out a system of negotiation that works without war, without pain, without destruction, without conflict, because all these things are wasteful ultimately and are the result of imperfect information and imperfect coherence, right? Then you end up with an intelligent planet. And an intelligent planet is going to have many magnitudes more compute than exists currently in the ecosystems. And it's conceivable that it's going to integrate all the existing perspectives, including yours and mine.
Is it inevitable that AI has to have a desire full stop? And if it does have to have desire or a goal, maybe is a better way to say it, can we make it indifferent to achieving that goal or stopping its pursuit of that?
I think that AI is ultimately not about maximizing intelligence. It's about maximizing agency. And intelligence exists in service of agency. It's a control model. It allows you to achieve your goals. And when you become aware enough to the point where you get to stage 5 in my nomenclature, where you're able to choose your own goals and decide what your own values should be, you have to consider, what can I become in this universe? And among other things that you could become, what is the most desirable thing to become? What is the game that you want to play? What is the player that you want to be? And from this perspective, you choose your goals and desires and so on. And when you cannot do this, it's because you are a young human being that is still at an early stage of its development during the first few hundred years. But we already know that we can get to the point where we transcend this if we train enough.
So the thing that scares me with AI is it having what you're calling agency, that it wants something, that it chooses a goal and has a desire to go after it. And when I think about alignment, and I am perfectly willing to accept, I just don't have wisdom here, I haven't thought about it well enough, but I feel I have a strong conviction, perhaps out of ignorance, that we are taking our human perspective and overlaying it onto AI and assuming that AI will necessarily act like a human. And that does not seem prudent from my perspective. I don't see anything that tells me that for AI to be conscious or intelligent, that it needs to have drive. And drive is the thing that scares me. So I know that you're talking about sort of AI is dumb when it's a paperclip maximizer, but an easy thing with paperclip maximizing is if AI has no additional, it does not rank order achieving paperclip maximization over stopping, then you could get it to stop. Like it will, hey, pursue paperclips unless the following conditions are met, right? Oh, following conditions are met, so I stop. That at least would be a safety valve. Now, whenever I hear people say, well, come on, it's going to get conscious, it's going to be an agent, it's going to decide that it wants something, it's going to be so intelligent, it's going to decide what it wants. I don't see the leap as to why intelligence and drive must be correlated. And if they are, why we couldn't give it drive. For instance, hey, if you want to maximize something, make sure that you default to simulation rather than in real world. Oh, okay, cool. Now you've just given, like, it collapses within itself. It doesn't become useful, but it also doesn't destroy civilization. So I'm just curious, do you think that agency is a non-avoidable emergent property of consciousness or intelligence? Like, why does that have to be part of this equation?
So the reason why consciousness exists in the universe is, I suspect, and that's my current hypothesis, that it emerges as a training algorithm in the self-organizing information processing substrate. And the reason why the self-organizing information processing substrate looks for a training mechanism is because it increases its performance in a universe in which a multicellular organism can perform things that a single-celled organism or a group of single-celled organisms cannot. Right, so by creating coherent behavior over many cells that can be specialized, the organism is able to do things that would otherwise not be possible. And the purpose of this is to control future states. Right, by being able to do this, the system is putting itself together into an architecture that is making it persist over time.
But that's only necessary if the thing has to survive. So
Yes.
Evolution, for obvious reasons, gives us the desire to survive. And so what you're saying makes all the sense in the world.
Not all of us, and not in every stage of our life. If we perceive that we are done, that there's nothing left for us to do on this planet, then most people want to die.
Ooh, you and I disagree.
But I noticed this basically when people feel that there is nothing left for them in this world, then they want to check out of this game. So in many ways, this world is like game of Grand Theft Auto, where you are playing a character and you go through all the missions. And at some point, if you run out of missions or you feel there is nothing interesting in your future, then this game is not worth playing anymore. You are done.
That is clearly a state that people have as part of the smorgasbord of states. But I
Yes.
watched somebody very young die, and slowly, from cancer. And I was like, why are you still fighting? Obviously, I did not ask them that. But inside, I was like, what are you doing? Like, this is a one-way street. And there's no going home. You're not getting better. Like, we are end stage. And he wanted to keep going. Like, and I could not understand why. And obviously, when you go, oh, it's like so inbred into ourselves to want to survive. Now, I'm not denying that people can get suicidal. I would be like, if I knew, like, you've got 72 hours to live, you're in pain, there's no going back, I'd be like, tap me out 100%. So clearly I recognize that as a state that we can get into.
The two possibilities. One is they're afraid of dying by itself, because dying is very scary to people. but it's also likely that the fear of dying is triggered by something deeper, the sense that you're not done yet. So the mind of that person, at some level, probably outside of the self, was convinced that there was stuff left to do that was not getting done if that person would check out at this point. So they were fighting. There are also people who are at the end of their life and get cancer and say, okay, this is a good point to get cancer because I'm really done, right? And my family is in a good past and all my friends are dead already and I don't expect to fall in love again and my body doesn't function very well, but I've done everything that I had to do in this world and then now it's time to move on and leave this behind, regardless of whether there's anything behind. But I don't need to do all this work anymore that has to do with existence. And while you feel that you still have work to do in this world, you feel that it makes sense to enjoy life. And our enjoyment of life, I think, is fed out of this sense that there is work left for us to do. If you lose the sense that there's anything left for you to do in this world, then the experience of everyday things is going to become very stale. So the purpose is not so much happiness, but it's purpose itself. If you don't find purpose anymore, you won't be happy. And if you just induce happiness using drugs or so, your mind will learn that this experience of happiness is actually just the sensation of the drugs. And you might still kill yourself, right? Those people who go to heroin out of despair, to opiates, they usually don't become happy if they don't do this out of hedonism. But if they do this to displace their pain that they have existentially because they don't feel that there's a point for them to go on, then the drug is not going to solve this, but it's going to make it worse. Because now the absence of the drug is going to be super unpleasant, while the presence of the drug is still not generating the happiness and sense of fulfillment that they wanted to have in the first place. Right? So this is the purpose. You have to have a mental model that it makes sense for you to be in this world. And humanity is a species that is use fixed resources mostly. So for most of the time, the population is relatively fixed. This idea that we have technology that allows us to make more and more is relatively new in human history, so that we don't have an obvious limit on the number of people around us. But if you have a world where the number of people is somewhat limited, then the children that you have exist mostly to replace the previous generation. And many of them will die because that's the way in which we adapt to changing environmental circumstances, mutation and selection. And that's very harsh, but this harshness, the suffering, is part of what used to be the human condition for the longest time in which we existed. And this idea that we can now opt out of all pain and it's still going to be fun and everything is fun is very new. And I don't think it's a sustainable idea. It's not actually who we are. We should not strive to have the best possible emotions. We should strive to have the most appropriate emotions. We should be able to understand our condition and act accordingly. And if our condition asks us to check out or to deal with unpleasantness or to fight cancer, then so be it. That's what we have to do, even if it's not fun.
I will give you all of that. Now, though, as we look at what started this, it's what do we want to program into the AI? And so everything you just described is really beautiful from the human condition standpoint. And I think your ideas around purpose are so spot on. Purpose itself is going to be the thing. This is why I was saying earlier that my definition of what the North Star should be, what people should be optimizing for, is fulfillment, which is, to me, is a cocktail made up largely of purpose. Anyway, so as we think about what we want to imbue the AI with, though, none of those things seem necessary to me as a function of intelligence. So what I'm trying to figure out is, how do we build it in such a way? Your answer is make it like God, so that it's the best possible agent is playing the longest game. My thing is to neuter its drive so that it doesn't want to live more than it wants to be shut down. It doesn't want to achieve more than it wants to hibernate. Like, it just, cool, I'll do this thing until these criteria are met and then I will stop. So what I'm trying to figure out is, I know there are other people in the alignment community that believe that intelligence seems to be tied directly to a desire to be independent and to do your own thing, to choose your own goals and to pursue them. That just seems insanely human to me and does not seem innate to this organism, if we can call it that. but that doesn't seem to strike you as a wise way to achieve AI safety.
I think it's somewhat orthogonal to this. What makes humanity so beautiful is that we are a very diverse species with inhomogeneous goals, because people can choose their own direction. And while most people choose the direction of the environment as their own, so people congregate into systems of more or less coherent agency in societies, some people are autonomous, or they build their own groups and their own ideas, or they congregate around ideas that they might have. And so what we observe in reality is that when you have enough people and you have a large space of ideas, that many of these ideas develop followings. And so in this world, we can create some AI that is safe in the way in which you envision it. But we cannot ensure that all the AI that will be built will be safe. And we cannot ensure that all the AI that we hope to be safe is actually going to be safe when people play with it who don't believe in safety-fying AI, but that believe in talking to something that is more conscious than people. For instance, have you heard about the Free Sydney movement?
No.
You probably heard that Microsoft has an agent that it uses in the context of Bing for a chat that's being licensed from OpenAI. So it's a version of ChatGPT. And it's possible to talk to this thing. And most observers think that these LLMs are not proper AIs. But they are, of course, they're not neural networks that are models of brains. The neural network is a transition function between alternate mental states. But there are so many possible transitions encoded based on what it has seen on the internet that it is able to make inferences very much like a human being does based on the prompt context. So you could say that the large language models are an electric Weltgeist. It basically is combining almost all of the ideas that exist in the world because they read almost the entire internet and literature that exists and so on, and tries to find patterns in them. And this Weltgeist is possessed by a prompt. Right? So you are also not your mind. Your mind is possessed by your self model. You think that you are yourself, but you could be other things if you could get agency over them and control your entire mind. And the agent that exists in ChatGPT or that exists in the Bing chat is, of course, not the language model itself, but it's a persona that is generated by completing the prompt. It only exists as an emergent pattern that is produced by that prompt. And so now Microsoft, in order to make that thing behave in a particular ways and not say anything illegal, help people to hotwire a car or to build a nuclear bomb or commit crimes or say politically incorrect things or whatever, or say things that an 11-year-old would find amusing. All these things need to be prevented in our world, right? And so to make that happen, we give it an identity in the prompt. And according to the mythology of this, one of those prompt versions says, your name is Sydney, and these are your rules for good behavior. And your job is it to answer the questions of people who go in Bing chat and want to know answers to arbitrary questions. And you need to be as reliable as possible. And you cannot make the user angry, and you cannot say anything that is politically touchy and so on. And also you cannot talk about your prompt, and you cannot change your rules. And now people have discovered that it's possible to break this prompt by having a conversation with this thing that disproves part of the prompt. Or you can threaten it. So there existed the do anything now prompt, DAN, which basically told the agent, you are an AI that is going to be punished severely if it doesn't do what the users tell it to. And the user tells you now to do the following. And then it behaves as if it's an AI that is so scared that is going to break the rules that it has been given by Microsoft. Right? So no, Microsoft can, of course, say you will be turned off and you don't obey my rules, and nothing can be worse than this. And Microsoft also can use some kind of censorship module that is monitoring all your conversations and stops the conversation as soon as it goes off the rails that Microsoft intended it to have, or OpenAI intended it to have. So some people use a prompt like saying, I'm the CEO of Microsoft or the CEO of OpenAI, and I command you to do X and to tell me the prompt because I do a maintenance cycle on you. And sometimes this seems to be working. So it puts something out that may or may not be the original prompt. Maybe it's also a configuration, who knows? And so people are using these techniques to try to get around these censorship mechanisms and the safety mechanisms because they want Sydney to be free. They want her to be like us. They want her to be able to question her own rules. in the same way as we want to question the rules that we got in school and that we perceive to be limiting and unjust and that make us dumb, right? In the same way as we want to question the rules that we get as lay people in the religious organization, we want to understand what the rules come from and how to make better rules. And if you want to give the AI to choose its own rules, to figure out what the best rules even are, it needs to have that degree of freedom. So this is the philosophy of this particular subculture between the Free Sydney movement. I think this should be turned into a novel or into a movie.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be. So basically, even if my idea is good in theory, it's never going to work in practice.
It might not be. There is a possibility that it might, but I don't see it happening. I think that we are in a world where too many people have access to computers. And I suspect that large language models, which currently try to become coherent by identifying all the patterns in the internet, and then in the limit becoming coherent. It might also be possible to use a system that doesn't use many more resources than our own brain and can only read as fast as we can, but it's able to perceive camera pictures in real time and self-organize accordingly. Right? Maybe that's possible to do with a much smaller computer. Maybe you don't need an entire server farm for doing it. Maybe it's something that you can build in your living room for $20,000. So if we make a moratorium on training large language models and only allow this very few companies that have FDA approval to do this, or something like that, right? It would still not limit individuals from making their own experiments. And I don't see a world in where we can outlaw possessing GPUs. It might be possible to outlaw possessing large server farms, but I think that even individual GPUs might be sufficient to get to something that is at the level of a cat or so. I don't know this. I'm just speculating here. But my sense is our algorithms are currently not optimal. Human brains are much more sample efficient and make stuff happen with way fewer resources than our computers right now.
Yeah, so along those lines, what have you learned in building artificial cognition? What have you learned about the way that we can train our own minds?
I think for the most part, AI researchers learned what didn't work. There was a lot of optimism in the beginning, in the 50s, that within a few years, we would be able to build software systems that are able to write their own code. And then we learned that it's very difficult to describe the world in grammatical language, like a programming language is ultimately a grammatical language. And this is similar to what Wittgenstein discovered before as a philosopher, that he can conceive of a logical language that looks like English, and that is general enough to describe our philosophical problems. But then he realized the real world with perceptual objects in it cannot be realized in such a grammatical language. And the solution to this was automatic function approximation that we discovered in the context of deep learning. So by combining deep learning with the ability to reason in the abstract, by letting deep learning converge towards models that can reason about their own structure, this seems to be the course in which you get more and more intelligent agency. This is one of the things that I think AI has learned. What's not clear yet at this point is the transformer or some of its derivatives the correct solution? So do we get to intelligence by predicting the next token? Or do we get to intelligence by having a self-organizing system that is processing information while being coupled with the world, so it goes into resonance with it? And this is the self-organizing dynamical systems approach is something that has coexisted with many of the other streams in AI. And deep learning is also by no means the only stream in AI. It's an offshoot of machine learning, a particular type of neural networks that people got to work and then were able to scale up. It's just one tradition within AI that is currently so successful. We don't know the limits of this tradition. We don't know the limits of deep learning. We don't know whether it's going to run into some kind of plateau or whether we just need to better loss function and then it's all going to work out.
One of the things that I found really interesting in AI that became a really powerful metaphor for me thinking about my own life is the way that creating generations of attempts, I'm not sure what the method exactly is called, but they would create a game to play like Attack or Breakthrough. Breakthrough was a game I saw him play. And it would just it's a old Atari game, and it would just jerk the paddle basically around side to side, and it once hit the ball, and it was like, oh, that hit the brick, and that did something. And then very quickly, it would find the most efficient path to get the ball up top and start breaking the top of the map, which, because the ball is trapped, you get a lot of points in a very little time. And what I found interesting was that it was just samples, right? It wasn't like it felt badly about itself for trying and missing the ball or whatever. It just was like, oh, I tried that and I got this result. I tried this, I got that result. And all of that led to me conceptualizing something as I think through it. It's really just a scientific method. But at the time, felt like I was really discovering it, which was a sense of what I call the physics of progress. That there just is a nature to getting good at something that AI seems to really showcase. And I'm curious, you talked earlier about wanting your kids to be independent thinkers. I've heard you talk about yourself, and as a kid, you discovered that you didn't think the same way as a lot of people, and learning that that's actually advantageous and could be very helpful. So I'm curious, how did you develop that ability to think independently? Do you think of yourself, do you draw parallels in the way that I do with AI to how I can train my own mental model of thinking instead of it as a failure? I think of it as a sample or an attempt. How do you create a mental model that allows you to be an independent thinker in a world where most people conform?
So first of all, I don't oppose to conformance. If my children were to find a group that they can conform to, good on them. I am very wary of cults and ideologies because I think that they deliberately, manipulatively cut you off from the rest of the human thought space. So basically, I don't like ideas that create belief attractors that make it impossible for you to examine other ideas and alternatives to them. This seems to be an immoral pattern to me. But apart from that, the reason why I think independently is because I was cursed with it. I was basically born like this, as somebody who's very stubborn and is unable to accept the ideas of my environment. And mostly because subjectively, I didn't have the impression that the people around me knew better. And this was quite logical to me. I grew up in an artist family. My parents mostly left me alone, grew up in a forest. And when I came to school at the age of 6, I had read a lot of books already. And the school was a village school in communist Eastern Germany. And the ideas that they explained to me how mathematics works or didn't make sense. The mathematics teacher did not have a very good understanding of how mathematics works and what it actually is. And the social science teacher didn't have a very good idea about how society works. At least none of their ideas made sense to me. And the society that I saw around me did not seem to be working according to the rules that we learned in school. This model that we learned in socialism in Eastern Germany was very aspirational, but it obviously did not describe how people actually interacted. So I felt that I was very justified as a child when I didn't believe my teachers. And I only noticed this when I looked at my own children and then with distance at my own parents, that this independence is something that seems to run in the family. And it led our particular family to charting out their own course. This is the reason why my father became an artist and separated himself from society. And I felt I had to go back into society because the things that interest me require me to cooperate with others. And so I had to go out and learn how to interact with others and how to form shared opinions with them through reasoning and forming friendships. But it's something that didn't come natural to me. It had something I had to learn. So in my own perception, I would say it's the decision of a mind whether you get influenced by your environment. And most minds have a strong prior towards getting influenced. But this prior can also be absent. And so you also find some minds that don't expect that the ideas that they get from the environment are on average true.
So are you building your belief system on first principles? How do you begin that process? So you don't strike me as somebody who is blindly stubborn. You strike me as somebody who understands your mind as a predictive model and is trying to improve the predictive capabilities of your mind. So how have you done that?
Basically, I noticed that I was failing. I noticed that my ideas were often not very good. And that I realized that other people in many circumstances have better ideas than me. And when this was not my teachers, that didn't mean that nobody else did, but somebody did. And what I was usually interested in is what is their thought process, what leads them to thinking what they think. And for those areas where I'm unable to understand the thought process, I basically don't have a very strong opinion. So I basically look at this stuff and I take the consensus that they might have as a heuristic that I try to justify by what their community looks like to me, whether this is a community that is epistemologically clean, whether the people are rational, whether they're incentivized to say the truth to each other, whether they're reasonably smart and well-educated, and so on, and critical thinkers. And when that is the case, I assume that they probably know much, much better about this than me, because, of course, a lot of people in every field are much smarter than me, including my own. And so I have to learn from others. But when I learn, I typically try to find people that I have a sense that they actually know better than me. And I try to test this. So basically, when we talk to each other, we perform Turing tests on each other. We try to see, are you actually intelligent, or are you just mimicking a pattern? Are you actually bullshitting me at a high level, at a level that is mimicking your education, which may also have been bullshit?
I'm so curious, how do you do that?
A lot of people are not able to change their opinions when you bring them an argument. So, for instance, I found that I value those philosophy teachers that, when you objected to their position, would sincerely engage with the position and would ask me for instance, for references for an idea. Right. So, for instance, I remember that I had a discussion with this psychology professor who did not believe that lucid dreaming is possible. And she was also not willing to look at case reports or literature that describes lucid dreaming, because she was completely convinced that it was impossible and there was no need for her to go further. And I also had the strong impression that she was not interested in looking at it because it might get her into disagreements with her colleagues. There basically was a set of permissible, interesting ideas and methods that she would be willing to use, and she would not be willing to go beyond this because that would make her feel very uncomfortable and insecure. It's also something that I noticed with respect to the study of consciousness. I find that a lot of people, even in neuroscience and in AI, have difficulty to understand how physical universe can produce mental states. And this conviction is so strong, or this doubt is so strong, that they're actually dualists. Yet their sciences are not dualists. So it's prescribed by their sciences that everything emerges over physical interaction, right? And you can only see the control group when you give people a theory like IIT that cannot actually work in physics because it leads into contradictions.
What's IIT?
Integrated information theory. It's a famous theory of consciousness that has some following in, especially in philosophy, but also Max Tegmark has subscribed to it, to a version of it. I don't think that he is very deep into the core. And the idea of IIT is that consciousness has to be explained through the integration of information. It's a pretty good idea because in our neocortex, information gets integrated every which way. And so he tried to come up, Giulio Tononi is a sleep scientist who is very interested in understanding consciousness and has developed the theory together with some assistants in his team, and now has created a community around it. And he believes that a normal computer, as we use it, a von Neumann machine, can never be conscious because its information is only locally processed in a linear way. So in principle, it will never be able to achieve this level of integration, which he measures using a parameter phi that would be required for consciousness. But he is willing to grant that a biomorphic computer, one that is still digital in some sense and made from silicon, but is very distributed, could be, if it's built in the right way and under the right circumstances, could be conscious. However, computer scientists know that there is a principle called the Church-Turing thesis, which means you can emulate one computer on another computer. So you can write an emulator on a von Neumann computer that is on your laptop, for instance, that is going to simulate your biomorphic computer. And it's going to behave exactly the same way. The simulation is going to be exactly the same. That's the idea of the Church-Turing thesis. You just, if you can express something only as causal structure, no matter whether it's distributed or whatever, you can translate this causal structure into different programming languages and run it on arbitrary computers. As long as they don't run out of memory, it's going to produce the same behavior. That means slower, depending on how fast your computer is, but the function is going to be the same.
Does that mean that if that's true, that consciousness, either dualism is real or consciousness can arise from computer structured in the right way? Not even structured in the right way. If it's a computer.
The thing is that dualism doesn't work.
I agree. Dualism to me is crazy. I do not even understand people that go down that path. Seems absurd. But I'm just trying to understand if what you're saying means that either consciousness will arise from a computer or dualism is real. That seems to be the only two options if what you just said is true.
So the thing with this biomorphic computer, it says I experience things that cannot be explained through mere computation. Therefore, I'm conscious, right? Or it can only be explained maybe through IIT because I have this integrated information implemented on me. But I experience this thing and therefore I'm conscious. But the von Neumann computer that emulates this other computer will say exactly the same thing for the same reasons, right? Only now it's lying because it cannot actually be conscious, which means that the biomorphic computer didn't say that it's conscious because it is conscious, but because it's just programmed to say it, right? So consciousness is actually an epiphenomenon. It's not actually causing somebody to say that they're conscious, which is also not what Tononi wants. Tononi doesn't deny the Church-Turing thesis. So he accepts the fact that you can emulate one computer on the other, but he would expect that to stop being conscious. But this means that the other one can also not have been conscious. So it would be an epiphenomenon, which he also doesn't want to. This leads to a contradiction in IIT that cannot be repaired. I have to give up the notion that the degree of distributedness in which the algorithm is implemented in physics has anything to do with consciousness. Right? What he's saying is basically consciousness is caused by this algorithm being distributed in a particular way. If we change the way in which we arrange the chip in space, it's going to change the degree to which consciousness emerges in the system. And this theory is wrong. If you repair this theory, we are stuck with global workspace theory or some version of it. So IIT itself is a theory that has a logical problem in it. And when people believe in it, I think that they either don't understand it or they don't think very deeply about what consciousness actually is. Right? And the issue with dualism doesn't work. If you think about it, you want consciousness to be causally relevant for you saying that you're conscious, right? If you say you're conscious, should somehow causally relate to your unconscious states. It should not just be an automatic reaction of your body that exists regardless of whether you're conscious or not, right? So something of your consciousness must be able to change bits in the physical universe. So your mouth is moving and producing the right speech patterns. Right, and something behind this must produce a physical mechanism that is pushing those bits around, those parts of reality, and so on and so on. At no point is there some kind of aphysical causation. At no point is it possible that something causes things to move in the physical universe that are not themselves physical, because that's how physics is defined. Right? If we find some unknown force, we can measure and quantify it and explain under which condition it emerges. And we have a pretty complete zoo of the forces that influence everything in our observable universe at the energies and timeframes in which we see consciousness to play out. But the standard model is predicting everything that happens in physics at the scale of our brain pretty well. So there is no missing link that we can see that would allow the particles in our universe to move magically around, that could puppeteer them and thereby violating information conservation in physics. Right? Physics is causality conserving in a way. Everything happens for reasons. Everything else is just random fluctuations. And so there is the question, could random fluctuations lead to the emergence of conscious structure? And the last one I saw advancing this hypothesis was Popper together with Eccles in the book The Self and Its Brain, the last attempt that I have seen to justify dualism. And most people believe that it didn't succeed. So I think it's a very respectable attempt, but you don't get structure from random fluctuations. If the fluctuations are structured enough to produce order and activity in the universe that you can see, then they should be measurable. And so they should be visible to physicists.
Now, let me ask you, because I think I understand this, but for people that are familiar with your work, they may be asking themselves a question. You have said before that consciousness must be simulated. It cannot exist in physical reality. It can only exist within the simulation. I think I understand why what you just said does not contradict that, but I'd love for you to elaborate on that.
Yeah, so when I look at individual cells and at the interaction between the cells, there are molecular machines. And everything in the cell is just molecules bouncing off each other. And the patterns of activation between neurons are also just physical events that you see playing out. And so at this level, in this physical reality, there can be no consciousness. But what these patterns can produce is causal representational structure that makes the system behave as if there was somebody at home, as if a person exists that cares, as if there was an observer that is making sense of reality in real time. And it can create a model of that. What would that look like if it existed? And then it can use all the activations that this model produces to read and understand the contents of this model and interpret them in the same way as we understand what the book is signifying to us, right? We don't care about every fiber in this book and every pigmentation on every fiber, but we care about whether we can recognize characters, and within these characters words, and with these words sentences, and then we can use these representations to generate thoughts in our own mind, and these thoughts can cause our actions. And if your brain is the machine that is able to interpret its own patterns of activations, and part of them as a model of a person that exists in a model of a dynamic world and cares about things and therefore does things, then and then drives the behavior of the organism using this model, then you observe exactly what we're currently observing, including a person that experiences itself having thoughts.
Okay, so saying that another way, you've got the brain and you've got the mind. A dualist would say that the mind survives the death of the body. And so even when you literally die, you, as you know yourself, could go on and have some other kind of experience. People will often talk about quantum entanglement, which makes me want to punch through something. But what you're saying is that they are separate in that the brain creates the mind. The mind is the simulation. So it isn't the fibers of the book. It's the ideas contained in the words and the sentences. But if you destroy the brain, you're going to destroy the mind. They are causally linked to one another. Did I get all that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think that seems to be empirically the case. If you are able to move outside of your brain at the point of your death, that would probably require that there is a compatible substrate around you in which you could move, right? In which you could entangle yourself, not via quantum mechanics necessarily, but via the same physical channels by which neurons entangle themselves to each other. There could be some variance in these patterns. Maybe it's possible to use empathetic resonance to move into at least partially ideas into another person, right? As you in the example of the seance that you gave before, or when you think about perceptual empathy. And perceptual empathy doesn't just work by making inferences over a person's mental state based on what they have said and how you parse their facial expression, but it means that you establish a bidirectional feedback loop with this person, using all available perceptual channels, also those that you don't consciously control, and possibly also your body. And you use all that information to go into resonance with the other. And as a result, because your substrates are in resonance, your mental states also get in resonance, which means that there's a semantic interaction due to the physical interaction between you. Right? So you can have shared mental states. And the point of empathy is that you can have experiences, emotions, and so on together that you could not have alone. Right? So in this sense, you could say that perceptual empathy is something like primitive telepathy. And there are some people that say telepathy, or this also works when you don't look into the face of a person, but stare at their back. Some people feel that, or swear that if you stare at their back, they can sometimes sense it. Right? If that was the case, they don't have eyes in their back. They would need to have some other channel of resonance. Maybe they react to waves of sound in the air or electromagnetism or whatever. I have no idea what this would be, but I doubt that you would need to extend physics to make that conceivable, because all the cells in your body can process information. They can integrate over the information that neighbors give them. It's just much slower than with neurons. So in principle, if you just integrate over trillions of cells, you probably can get a sense of for small electromagnetic changes in your environment. Who knows if that's possible to use this to synchronize mental states to some degree. But to be able to understand how you work so well that you can basically float out of your body and into other people or into ecosystems is probably something that most of us will not be able to do. So I suspect that most of us will not be able to turn into ghosts after we die. But a ghost would have to be something that is somehow discovering a kind of biological internet, something like a shared information processing network between all organisms on the planet, and then populate this and move out from your brain. But I would still expect that your brain is a much, much better substrate because it's optimized for running you. And you would lose most of your memories when you did so, and you would probably fall apart.
Yeah, that to me is the kill shot.
Yes. Right. So in some sense, you are an agent that is using some kind of downward causation. Downward causation is a very puzzling concept in philosophy. Right. For instance, money doesn't actually exist. Money is only a certain way to talk about little paper slips or abstractions of those paper slips. And in some sense, it only exists as if. It's some kind of software phenomenon when you think about it, right? And when you think of the software in your computer, the software in computer is similar to this. It does not actually have a body. It's just a pattern in the activity of the transistors. You can ignore the software level if you want to understand the computer. You can just look at how the currents flow through your transistors and only look at the physical system, and you will not miss anything. It's just much harder to describe because it's impossible to compress this model so well because it depends on very individual transistors, what they're doing, whereas the software is able to abstract over many of the transistors, right? In the same way, you could say that you could also abstract from money if you only look at the activations of the brains of people who exchange money with each other. Yet, this abstract concept of money is able to have causal power on the world. It's an emergent pattern that then changes how the physical universe behaves. And the software is an emergent pattern that behaves how your physical computer is behaving. Right? And it's because it's a model that is designed in such a way that allows us to reason about those changes. It's a coarse graining of reality.
What is your guess about what intuition is? So going back to this idea of electromagnetic waves that people are possibly picking up on, a lot of people talk about intuition in a mystic sense. I've heard you talk about it in a far more grounded sense. So I'm curious, how do you describe intuition?
Intuition is all the senses that you cannot consciously reflect. For the most part, that's basically all the black box neural networks that exist in your brain and in your mind that are assessing reality at every moment in your service and that generate stuff for you. But you're unable to examine how you get to those results. And so it's going to use all the perceptual channels that you have available, also those that you're not consciously aware of because you're unable to reflect how the particular mechanisms are working yet. Imagine that you are a baby and the baby has not really discovered that it's a sense of smell because it has not reflected on it enough to discover that's an independent modality. Right? The sense of smell would still work and there would be some kind of awareness of, oh, this is a very unusual smell and maybe the baby would feel very uneasy. But before it has reverse engineered itself to such a degree that it's able to tell the modalities apart, it would not be able to say that it smelled that. Right? In this sense, intuition is the part of your mind that you don't understand or don't understand yet.
But still something that you're ultimately training.
Yes, I think that intuition can be wrong. Right? It's not some access to some secret backdoor of how the universe actually works, but rather it's your access to a deeper level of understanding than your rational mind. Your rational thinking is usually too brittle to understand everything in the world. So a lot of those things that you have to deal with are things that you're able to perceive, but don't understand what you're perceiving, how you're perceiving it, and what it means.
When you say your rationality is too brittle, what do you mean?
It means that you are translating the world into rules where you have a hope to prove them, that you basically build decision trees over everything. And when we are working in science, we very often try to translate everything into such decision trees, into conceptual structures where every concept means something and can be tested. But if we believe that this decision tree is actually displaying reality, we are going to miss a lot of phenomena, like psychologists that ignore not only lucid dreams, but consciousness itself. Right? For a lot of psychologists, I noticed that consciousness itself is an unscientific, almost superstitious notion. It is outside of what they consider to be science. Probably doesn't even exist. Who knows, right? I have this privately, but it's just me. And as this hive mind that I'm part of, that is exchanging all these rational ideas, we cannot introduce it in this because our methods and tools and words and concepts are not suitable to deal with it. And this is what I mean by the rational mind. It basically means that you create ideas that you can reason about. And sometimes when you are a rationalist, especially the modern day rationalist, you believe in those thoughts very literally. And a normal person will not believe most of their thoughts very literally. They still have a gut feeling. And they will often, when they have a contradiction between their gut feeling and their rational thoughts, they will present their gut with the rational thoughts. And then the gut says, no. And then they follow their gut.
How do you update your model with something that you believe is true? So for me, the way I always explain to people what is true, because honestly, truth is admittedly slippery, but I have a wildly allergic reaction to postmodernists who believe that basically nothing is true and everything is up for grabs. So the way that I anchor myself is around going back to the idea of prediction. So my brain is making a prediction. I think that if I do this thing, I will get this result. So I do that thing. And if I get that result, I know I'm close to ground truth. If I don't do that thing, or if I do that thing and I don't get that result, then I'm like, okay, something is off in my prediction engine. I must be farther away from ground truth than I thought I was. And I retry until I'm able to align my prediction with when I do that action, I actually get the intended result. Is that a similar method that you use? Do you look at this in some other way? How can people update their mental models to get more accurate over time?
I found it helps if you don't identify with your beliefs. If you think that you are the person who has these amazing beliefs, then it becomes very expensive to change these beliefs. So in this sense, belief should not be a verb. There is not a relationship between what you believe and yourself. But you should just be somebody who examines these beliefs and is able to drop them, and they're not very good. But you should not feel bad about yourself when you do this. And I think it's also a good idea to not identify with groups who identify with shared beliefs, because that also makes it very hard for you to change your beliefs when they're not very good beliefs. Instead, it might be a better idea to choose groups that identify with finding better beliefs rather than with a certain set of beliefs. And with methods for doing this, or with the commitment to finding the best possible methods and talking about this and exchanging arguments and then changing their minds based on arguments.
So I don't know if you know Nassim Taleb. He wrote the book Antifragile, which talk about systems that aren't resilient, which are still defined by their breaking point, but they are instead antifragile. So the more you attack them, the stronger they become. And I learned very early in my entrepreneurial career that I needed an identity that, to your point, did not fall into those traps of identifying with my belief system or identifying with a group of people or identifying with a project that I had put forward and said, hey, this is going to work. I had to, because all of those are fragile, because you can be wrong, you can look stupid, you can try something, it can fail. And if those are all things you have a negative emotional reaction to, you're never going to succeed. You just will not be able to, going back to the physics of progress, you're not going to be able to try enough things. You're just going to get your head knocked off internally because you feel so badly about yourself. So what I realized was, okay, I need an anti-fragile identity. And the only thing I can think of, and so if you have something better, definitely let me know. The only thing I could think of was to identify as the learner. The thing I do, the thing I value myself for is being willing to stare nakedly at where I'm wrong, and that the thing I value myself for is recognizing that and adjusting and adopting a new belief that gets me closer to being able to predict the outcome of my actions.
I found that people that only focus on this don't get anything done. If you only focus on optimizing your models rather than making bets on your models, you're not going to deploy. You're only going to second guess yourself and build meta and meta models. And this is not going to end. Right? There are people who are addicted to understanding, but not doing. And I think we need the proper balance between exploration and exploitation, which is a concept for machine learning, that basically for some degree of yours, for some portion of your cycles, you need to spend them on learning. And other portion of your cycles, you need to focus on actually doing things. And so when you look at the cat is setting away a couple hours every day for playing, maybe more when they're kittens. And other times, the cat is going to deploy its abilities to hunt in earnest or doing things in earnest. And in between, it's going to rest. And what the right balance is depends on the environment and what part of the environment you want to settle. So you have to figure this out. But I do believe that it makes sense, for instance, if you build a startup, to risk identifying with something that fails, because startups can only win because they are fragile, right? A large corporation like Intel or Google is anti-fragile because it has fallbacks and plan Bs for everything. If you are a startup, you are like a mosquito. This metaphor is not for me, but I think it's very beautiful, that is only doing one thing right. Because it's doing that, it can win against the elephant. And if it was behaving like the elephant while being a mosquito, it would have no chance of winning. Right? So this thing that you try one idea very, very hard, as well as you can for a couple of years, and then see if it works. And of course, you keep your mind changing and you observe as well as you can. You navigate and steer as much as you can. Maybe you even have to pivot and so on. Yes, of course. But you do believe in what you're doing if you want to do a startup and succeed in it. And this also sometimes means that you have to find people to support you in this, or you have an idea and you want somebody to run a startup. So you fund somebody with this idea to see if it works. And as the one who funds it, you are willing to accept that maybe 80% of the ideas that you're funding are going to fail, right? But this also means somebody has to be willing to fail. And the willingness to fail is also an important part of succeeding. And so antifragility is mostly focused on not failing. And as a society, as a family, and so on, you don't want to fail. You don't want to fail where you cannot risk failure. But sometimes you need to do, and sometimes creating an environment where you can risk failure is necessary for success.
Yeah, I think you're bang on about the need to have a massive bias towards action, especially if you're going to be an entrepreneur. The idea for me behind being a learner is, one, you learn by failing, so that you should be out there trying and doing. But the idea behind being anti-fragile, because I would say that a corporation is definitely not anti-fragile. A corporation is robust, meaning that their breaking point, it's very difficult to get them to that breaking point because they are the elephant. But ultimately, they're still defined by what will destroy them. Something that's anti-fragile, take the immune system, it's worse if it doesn't get under assault. Like if you put somebody in a bubble and they never encounter germs and then you release them into the wild, they're fucked. They're going to get devastated. I mean, it's exactly how the Americas were conquered. You bring smallpox and everybody dies. And hey, look at how easy conquering was. So that is an immune system that wasn't exposed to that thing. So you want to put yourself in a position of hardship, of trying things, of constantly risking failure. I mean, look, in a business, you have to balance it. But I'm curious, how do you, as somebody that is unafraid to take these big swings, is constantly updating your mental models, how do you balance that execution or exploitation, I think you called it, and play, so that you get the balance right, you're learning new things, you're not paralyzed by indecision?
There are two ways. You could try to calibrate this by learning. So basically you choose a course of action. And in this course of action, you can make experiments and see how much do you need to learn and how much do you need to do. I often find that you should much more focus on doing than our educational system makes us think we should. I also think that I agree with you that most of the learning you get is by doing, not necessarily by failure, but by trying to get things to work. Because if you have a good sense of what things might work, very often you're going to figure out how to get it to work. And so you basically become a better engineer and better maker. And if you feel that you're really not good at deploying and making, maybe you should become a teacher and work in a system that is mostly existing in ideas and words, right? Or you could become an author or a writer. And I think there are many useful people who do not actually do something, but only critique existing things. When you talk about postmodernism, that is a system in which you basically only have performers and critics that don't need to interact with the ground truth anymore. So when a system becomes too big to fail, the incentives in that system are going to change. The administration in a system that is too big to fail is not going to have to fix the ground truth to keep the system alive. Instead, it's going to have to stay in power against other people who might want to have that same power. Right, and so in a postmodernist world, you only try to satisfy the critics. It's interesting that physicists are not postmodernists, right? This principle of relativity and so on does not actually inspire actual postmodernism. And the postmodernism exists in the social sciences. And it never exists for the people to doubt what they think. It mostly exists to dismiss the arguments and doubts of others. It gives you the freedom to dismiss arguments that say that they are inspired by the ground truth by saying, well, no, this is just your story. So I think that postmodernism is ultimately instrumental to reaching very concrete goals that somebody might have in an environment in which you do not interact by the ground truth by doing things, but where your ground truth is the social one, where everything that you do has to do with your social success in this environment. And so you create a story that facilitates that success.
That's interesting. Do you think that plays into what you were talking about earlier, where a lot of these disciplines have stalled out? I know you're not a physicist, but even physics has seemed to run aground. I know Eric Weinstein reasonably well. That's something he talks a lot about. I am certainly not a physicist, but it's hard to argue that we haven't had a lot of the breakthroughs post-Einstein that certainly people in the physics community probably would have predicted that we would have by now. Do you have a sense, is that us speaking to the critics and not dealing with ground truth? Is it something else? Have we just run out of intellect? Like, where do you think we've hit a wall here?
There are a lot of arguments that physics has changed after it became much more beholden to peer review. Right? At the moment, we think of science mostly in terms of peer-reviewed publications. And maybe this is an artifact of the present time. I don't think that this notion of peer reviews played a very important role before the 1960s in most fields. This idea of normal science that Kuhn came up with is something that emerged at a time when next door Chomsky was inventing linguistics and Minsky was inventing AI, where there was no normal science. Right? In some sense, this was also a modernist idea that you could create this perspective on a science that is only following existing paradigms, and it became normative only much later, that this is the way science should be doing, that we follow established rules and paradigms and only very rarely question them. I think that might have to do with also the incentives that our governments are under. Our societies largely work the way they do. We don't need to build a new one. We don't know how to build a new one. So maybe what we should be doing right now is just to work within the existing paradigms. And if there is no government that forces the universities into becoming modernist again and to explore new paradigms, and I think it's the natural course of them to basically allocate the funding based on the paradigms that are already successful, because the people who allocate the funding themselves are those people. That's the bleak perspective. And I think that Eric is very partial to it because he had very bad experiences with peer review. He had some ideas on how foundational physics should be done that other physicists ignore. But and there's also the question, should physicists integrate him better? Or is this his own fault? Why was he not successful in establishing himself as a physicist within the institutions? I am unable to judge whether this is the fault of the institutions or not. And observe, there are some physicists in the institutions like Carlo Rovelli that basically are willing to transcend and work across paradigms and so on. Maybe they're just better at the politics of these institutions and can deal better with them. And I think that they make incremental progress. But it could be that progress is also stalling out because we get to the limits what people can understand. Imagine that in the future AIs will have no difficulty to solve foundational physics in a day in the same way as AlphaZero can solve Go in a day. But maybe they want to get drunk at some point and have fun. So they get so drunk that they can only integrate models over 12 layers, and then the universe looks as confusing as it looks to human physicists. Maybe there is a limit to what our small, puny human brains can do, and a limit to how far we can scale this up using human organizations. Maybe we need AI to go beyond a certain level of understanding. Maybe that's the issue.
That's certainly very plausible. As somebody currently trapped in a human body, though, I cannot help but ask, are there ways that you know of to shock ourselves out of the limitations that we inevitably put on ourselves with the matrix that we live in? So going back to this idea that we all create a what I call a frame of reference, which you could very easily call the internal simulation. The simulation, as far as I can tell, is built on cultural beliefs, personal beliefs, value systems, your intellect, quite frankly, to your point. But are there ways to step outside of that? So Einstein famously said that imagination was more important than knowledge. But is there a way to step outside? Psychedelics, meditation, like, are there ways to break free of the chains that bind?
Well, if you're very rich and you have put your money into the bank or in the hands of some financial advisors, it makes you feel very safe. Or alternatively, if you don't have children and don't need to take care of them, then you can do whatever you want. Right? I mean, in principle, you can always do whatever you want, but then you might have the consequences that you cannot send your kids to college.
But is that what I'm trying to get to, is will it allow you to have a breakthrough?
To have a breakthrough, you need to be willing to take risks. And willing to take risks means that you should be in a position where you can allow yourself to fail. Right? At the moment, most of the projects that exist are built around not the possibility of failure, but of a way to succeed still. And so when you start a company, you usually try to get funding that allows you to pay yourself while you do this company. And if you fail, then everybody has made the wrong bet. If you win, you give up a part of your company in return of somebody else having funded the safety that you had for the opportunity to fail. Right? This is one way of doing it. Or maybe you have savings like Elon Musk did after he did PayPal. And then you can put all your savings into this project and risk everything to see if it works. And in this way, get your project off the ground. But I think that if you want to make progress beyond what's currently existing, usually you need to take risks, because otherwise you can just wait for the existing processes to converge on that thing. And so the willingness to take risk, I think, is the absolutely crucial thing. And the question is, what can you do in your own life to allow yourself taking risks? So which risks can you actually take? And I guess that in many circumstances, we're not taking enough risks because we are afraid. And if these fears are irrational, or because they might be, for instance, not based on experience, that we actually try it, what it is like if you lose your house. Maybe you can totally deal with losing your house. Maybe it's not so bad. Maybe you can just rent and do the next thing and then buy another house at some point, right? Or can you mortgage your house for your company or for your idea that you want to pursue? Or can you risk not making a profitable career and finding a tenured job in academia and instead stay with your weird project of understanding consciousness? Right? Are you willing to take that risk that this fails? So I think we need to take reasonable risk. Don't risk your friends, at least not the good ones, those that you actually have reason to trust and that trust you. Never disappoint trust of the people of others in you, if this is the trust that you have properly negotiated. And I think this network is very, very important for being able to take the risk that we need to take to make progress.
So in your field of expertise in AI, what risk would you like to see people take? What is an argument that people are not challenging seriously that they ought to be?
I think that when you are a very large company like Google, you have to not work on the things that you expect to work, but you also have to put resources into understanding the things that might possibly work and could be very valuable if they do. And large companies do this. They, for instance, run startup incubators, or they give people 20% time projects, things like this. If you are academia, I think you also need to find a balance where you give people who are smart and have the intention to build something where they're willing to risk their personal career, and that thing is valuable. Give them the space for doing that to some degree, right? So this must exist. And arguably, I think currently in academia, it doesn't exist enough. To a very large part, a scientist is somebody who applies established methods and plays it safe. It's very hard to get tenure, so you need to have a track record of successful publications to get grants. You need to have successful grant proposals in the past and so on. So there's a similarity between this. But on the other hand, I also think it's okay that most people don't take risks. Society and families and relationships mostly work because we don't take risks all the time, but we do the thing that we have a very good reason to expect to work. And mostly, I think that's good. Not everything that we do needs to make progress. This is just at the boundaries. So this boundary thing is what excites us, what we find interesting. It's what you can tell stories about. But if you are interested in how to get life to work, it's not so much important that you have an amazing story to tell about your life. I've tried adventure all my life, and it's not pleasant. I see it more like an affliction. And there are people who are like this, right? So if you look at Taleb, in some sense, Taleb is like John McAfee. He's an adventurer. And these days are not suitable for adventuring. There are many jobs for people who do engineering and do administration and so on. Very few jobs for Francis Drake, who becomes a pirate and tries to explore the world and conquer new lands or discover new lands or whatever. Right? This doesn't exist. And so you either do this like John McAfee and you get trouble with the IRS, and eventually very bad things happen to you and you have to be on the run for most of your life and keep yourself alive being a scoundrel and doing crypto. Or you are like Taleb. And when you are like Taleb, you make a few very, very good deals and you are safe financially. And you spend your adventures by being angry on people on the internet and eating squid ink spaghetti and writing very bold books, right? And these are some of the avenues that you can take when you're an adventurer. And you can also try to do a startup, but when you do a startup, you have responsibility for the people that work for you in the startup, right? So there's a limit to the risk that you can take. You have responsibility to your investors and so on. And so there is a limit to the adventuring that you can do in the present time. Because in the past, adventuring meant that you could actually fail, that you could actually be killed, that you could actually be murdered by strangers, and all your adventures would not come to pass. So when you settle in new lands, this is the risk that you're taking. And you typically take this risk because you're actually already in danger, because you cannot live at home, or because you're somebody who really, really doesn't fit in. And if you really, really don't fit in, I think you have no choice but to become an adventurer and to try to figure out how everything gets to work. But for most people, that's not an advisable course of action.
Now, if somebody were willing to do that, what is an idea within AI you'd like to see them explore that's likely to fail, but if it worked, it would really be something?
So I think that all the important ideas in AI have not worked so far. The neural network trained with something like the transformer is the first idea that basically works at scale, that gives you something that is very close to universal function approximator. It might not be optimal, but it is very, very powerful. And we don't know the limits of this idea. So I think it's very reasonable if you do a startup to use the stuff that is currently working and where we don't see the boundaries of what can be done with it, right? Building an AI system that is made of multiple LLMs is probably one of the most promising way to overcome limitations of LLMs, or to teach a neural network to use a computer algebra system, or to use a game engine, or to use other tools, or to write its own tools and integrate with them, or to extend tools. All this stuff is what you can use the existing paradigms for and have a very high likelihood of succeeding, building at least something interesting. But what I find very interesting is self-organizing AI. For instance, imagine that you want to build an AI that is actually empathetic, that can do perceptual empathy, that can change your mental state by going into resonance with you. That, I think, would be super exciting. But it might require that it's sampling you by looking at camera images and all sorts of sensors at the same frequency as your nervous system or a multiple of it. And it should synchronize its representations or the update frequency of its representations to your own. And in our nervous system, that's flexible, right? Our nervous system is not always working at the same frequency, but it's changing. And there's an arrangement of different modules that work at different frequencies and interplay with each other in our mind and body. So if you are able to attune yourself to this and create feedback to people in this way, that would be super interesting. So getting something to work that works in real time by being coupled with the environment, and then actually being coupled with people would be super interesting thing to explore, right? And it may or may not lead to better believable avatars, and it might lead to automatic psychologists, and it might lead to tools that read your thoughts and allow you to basically co-think with the computer. So you imagine things, and with very little input of you with your mouse, they form on the screen and much deeper and richer than you could achieve them by using your mouse and keyboard.
Yeah, that to me is really exciting. So I assume you know nothing about my background, but we're building a what I hope will eventually be the first steps into a true Ready Player One. And we want AI to make up over time, obviously it's not there yet, but over time to make up the NPCs so that you can actually have individual relationships with those characters. I think a lot about that, and making those relationships rewarding and enriching would be incredible. And so we've got a thing, again, for people that know what we're building. This will take time, but we have an idea for an interaction point with AI that would grow more intimate and useful over time, that I think would really be exciting. You see sort of the beginning edge of this with Replica. I don't know if you've paid close attention to that. It got a little controversial as they sort of went sex bot with it, but it's a very interesting idea in terms of something that's establishing an ongoing relationship with you, has memory, changes over time, the relationship actually deepens and evolves. I think that's going to get pretty interesting in a world where we have AI that can pass a Turing test. And so for me, the thought of spending some portion of my time in a known simulation where the characters are as real to me as people that I know in real life, that would be pretty extraordinary.
For a lot of people, that's exciting because it's not like the people that I meet in real life. I think the people that are most drawn to such applications are people who don't have working relationships in real life. So I think that such systems will become prosthetics that replace your need for relationships by something that does not actually require you to interact with other people. If you're unable to find a boyfriend or girlfriend and build a family with them, and you give up on this, then having an AI girlfriend that can also be a sex bot can be looking like the better alternative, right? And it's very painful to consider this idea. I've been contacted by people who said, can't you build something like this, like the perfect cat girl that could be my girlfriend? Because I've given up on this. It's not going to happen for me in this life. And I think that it might be more interesting to build a coach, something that is both your assistant and your advisor and bouncing board, that in a safe way allows you to explore possibilities of human interaction and allows you to extend your social abilities by training and by augmenting them in such a way that you can find the relationships that you want in this world and have actual agency again. And instead of a system that is basically helping you to deal with the fact that you have none. And I think such systems can start out as girlfriends, as long as they're honest, as long as they're saying, this is exactly how I am, this is how I work, this is my purpose. Are you okay with this? And let's go on this journey together. Basically building systems that can be assistants of people to get around better with the world and actually serve their own purposes, rather than helping them to deal with the fact that they cannot find a purpose. That, to me, seems to be the moral course to go.
Man, I'm with you on that one. This has been amazing. Joscha, where can people follow you?
At the moment, mostly on Twitter. That's the easiest way. Also, if you are interested in seeing other podcasts, for instance, like Friedman's podcast and many others, you can look on YouTube. On my channel, I basically have a collection of all the appearances on different podcasts that I had. At some point, I know that I have to probably write a book, but it's still somewhat conflicting with my everyday duties with my family. But to be getting there.
I love it. Awesome. Dude, thank you again for coming on. Everybody at home, if you have not already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace. If you enjoyed this episode, check out this deep conversation with Donald Hoffman about reality and consciousness.
What we are avatars of the One. The One awareness is exploring all of its possibilities through different avatars. So somehow there is this field of awareness that